Chapter 366. When Feng Ling found Jin Wan was searching every floor like a wandering ghost. Even some family members outside the other wards were startled by her. "Mrs. Mo?" Feng Ling hurried forward. Jin Wan seemed not to hear her. She turned into the escalator and went down. She had searched more than a dozen floors, and her feet and legs were numb. As soon as she stepped on the stairs, her legs suddenly softened and she staggered forward. "Jin Wan!" Feng Ling quickly rushed over to support her, but she was still a step too late. One of Jin Wan's knees had just touched the edge of the stairs. Although it was separated by a layer of trousers, she didn't need to lift the trousers to know that it must be bruised. "What the hell are you doing? Isn't Mr. Mo awake? What's wrong?" Feng Ling pulled her hard until she was dragged to the bench in front of the door of the next floor. She rubbed her legs and looked at her with concern. Jin Wan didn't speak, as if she couldn't feel the pain. Not long after, Jin Wan was forcibly taken to the hospital's lounge by Feng Ling. She called the doctor over to apply some medicine to her knee, and then sat by her side to accompany her. Jin Wan was silent for a long time, and suddenly leaned her head on Feng Ling's shoulder. She said, "I'm in so much pain." Feng Ling paused and looked down at her. "Where does it hurt? Shall I call the doctor over?" Jin Wan slowly raised her hand and pointed to her heart. "Here." Feng Ling frowned and roughly understood what Jin Wan meant. But what she couldn't understand was that Mr. Mo finally woke up. Shouldn't he be happy? Why did Jin Wan look as if she suddenly lost the whole world? Like a child abandoned in a corner of the world. So confused. Heartache. Why did she feel heartache? "Jin Wan." "Feng Ling, I want to be alone for a while." Jin Wan closed her eyes and said softly, "Are you worried about High City? Haven't you contacted the Ji family's servants? If you're really worried, we can fly back today, visit your father, and then fly back immediately. We can come back in a day or two." Jin Wan smiled bitterly and shook her head. "It's all right. Let me be alone for a while." Feng Ling was silent for a moment, stood up and walked out. There was no one in the lounge, and the sun had just risen. Jin Wan sat quietly for a while, got up, walked out, and entered the elevator. Feng Ling didn't follow her, but just watched from the side. When the elevator reached the top floor of the hospital, she immediately frowned. Qin Siding woke up. In fact, he had slept for less than 2 hours. When he went to the ward, Mo Jingshan was standing by the window. "Where is Jin Wan? Did she just come in? Why isn't he outside now?" Qin Siding asked. The man in front of the window did not answer. The room was silent and cold. Qin Siding narrowed his eyes coldly, and then gritted his teeth. "Don't tell me you've already said that to her?" The man remained silent. "Damn it, among us. Only you and Jin Wan had a smooth journey, and lived a comfortable and happy life. Now that we survived the disaster, shouldn't we cherish the people in front of us more? You can even give up your life for her. And she dares to put herself in the hinterland of a minefield for you. With such deep-rooted feelings, how can you divorce her? Are you king kidding me?" Qin Siding scolded. "Do you want to go down to the sea to accompany me in difficulties, because you see me suffering from Shinian's torture? You have to see if Jin Wan agrees or not. She is much more persistent than I thought. She has never wavered or given up on you. How can you just push away such a woman who follows you so firmly?" When Nan Hung came in, he felt that the ward was a little tense, but the person who was at daggers drawn was Qin Siding. Mo Jingshan, who had slept for 2 months and had just woken up for a day, just stood silently in front of the window and didn't move. "Since you've woken up, you should leave the hospital as soon as possible. Go back to the Mo family to recuperate, or go back to High City. I'm really tired of staying in a place like a hospital now." Nan Hung said, turned on the light in the ward, and then turned to look at Qin Siding. "You haven't had a good rest these days when he was asleep. Go back to High City, and love your Miss Sure as soon as possible." Qin Siding didn't speak but took a deep breath, turned to sit on the sofa by the window, and stared straight at the person in front of the window. Mo Jingshan glanced at him. "Why are you so free to meddle in other people's business now?" Qin Siding snorted. "I don't necessarily care about other people's business, but I'm one of your attending doctors. Seeing that you, a normal man, seem to have a mental problem after waking up, I'm considering whether to examine your brain again. Nanhung raised his eyebrows. Just now, when he found that Jin Wan was not outside, and there were only Mo Jingshan and Qin Sighting in the ward, he guessed that something was wrong, but he didn't know what exactly happened. Now he heard Qin Sighting said that Mo Jingshan had a mental problem. Nanhung sneered, leaned against the door, took out a lighter from his pocket, and played with it. Suddenly, he heard familiar footsteps outside, and he knew it was Feng Ling. At the moment when the door of the ward was knocked, he didn't even need to ask and directly opened the door. Feng Ling stood in front of the door and looked directly at Mo Jingshan in front of the window, saying, "Mr. Mo, Mrs. Mo has gone to the rooftop." Nanhung raised his eyebrows in surprise. Went to the rooftop? What was wrong with this woman? Qin Sighting also frowned in an instant. Mo Jingshan, however, looked particularly calm and said indifferently, "You are her bodyguard. She went to the rooftop. Why didn't you follow her? What are you doing here?" Nanhung. It seemed that he had heard something terrible, Feng Ling said coldly. "Mrs. Mo said she wanted to be alone and didn't let me follow her." The view on the rooftop was indeed very broad. Jin Wan stood on it and enjoyed the wind for a while. Then she stood at the edge, found a place to sit against the railing, and stared blankly at half of Los Angeles. She only sat here for a while, probably less than a few minutes, when the metal door on the rooftop was suddenly kicked open with a bang. A gust of wind blew. Jin Wan narrowed her eyes and heard Feng Ling's voice behind her. "Mrs. Mo, Mr. Mo asked me to take you down." Chapter 367. Feng Ling came over and stood by Jin Wan's side. "If you're in a bad mood, you can tell me or find another way to vent. This place is really not safe." "I know it's not safe, so I just sit behind the railing," Jin Wan said slowly. "I just want to enjoy the wind here. Besides," she paused and smiled reluctantly, "it's useless for you to tell him. He knows I won't seek death easily. He asked you to take me down just to be polite." During the 10 years of wandering, no matter how much she suffered, she never sought death. Her life was tenacious. The only time she sought death was when Ji Minggran destroyed her rationality. She lay in the bathtub, cut her wrists, and foolishly pushed this man away. Even at the last moment of her life, it was because she had taken slow-acting poison for a long time. If she was given the choice, she would choose to live on. She would never take things too hard. Mo Jingshan knew her well. Her heart was hard and her skin was thick. This was the current her in his eyes. Feng Ling's lips moved and she asked curiously, "Why did it suddenly become like this? Weren't you and Mr. Mo fine before?" "Yes, why did it become like this?" Jin Wan sat cross-legged, looked at the sky and squeezed out a smile. Her voice was a little hollow. "Maybe it's because of cause and effect. God gave me such a beautiful dream. But in the end, he took it back cruelly." Feng Ling didn't understand and didn't ask more. Seeing that Jin Wan was just sitting there obediently and didn't do anything dangerous, she sat down beside her. Jin Wan raised her hand and grasped in the wind. She felt a trace of cold air passing through her palm and then dissipated silently. It was as if she had thought she had finally grasped the happiness in front of her and finally learned to cherish it. But it turned out that it was just like a mass of air. It would dissipate if she said it would dissipate. To be honest, even Jin Wan didn't know how to face the Mo Jingshan 10 years later. Now, except for the loving memories of the past few months, he was still the same old him, the indifferent superior, the man who had completely withdrawn from her life. But could all these beautiful memories really be thrown away like garbage to him? Jin Wan looked at her empty palm for a long time and found that her eyes were very dry. Not even a single tear could fall. "The wind is too strong here. Don't sit here for too long," Feng Ling said. "I know. Just sit for a while longer." As Jin Wan spoke, she stubbornly raised her hand and caught 2 more times in the wind. This place was too high, and there was not even a speck of dust. The wind swept past her palm, leaving no trace. Mo Jingshan's physical condition was no longer a problem. After he woke up, the doctor conducted a series of examinations and observations on his current condition. After confirming that he could be discharged in a few days, his ward was also transferred to a normal ward. He was no longer restricted from family visits, so his ward was particularly lively these days. Wanju sat by the bed, peeling an apple, and talking about what had happened in the past 2 months. Emo Xiaoza occasionally answered a call from the company, and sat by the bed to ask Emo Jingshan how he was feeling. Kei Nan Hung and Qin Sighting were busy all over the place. But the man on the bed was always calm and indifferent. At this time, the door opened again. Wanju took a look and said with a smile, "Wan, what's wrong with you these days? When Emo Jingshan was unconscious, you couldn't wait to stay outside for 24 hours every day. Why did you say you were going to rest and sleep these days? You finally woke up and finally relaxed, didn't you?" Jinwan smiled and walked to the bed. "Yes, it's rare for me to relax, so I took some time to sleep." She didn't go to sleep, but because the owner of this ward didn't want to see her. Go to sleep. Anyway, Jingshan's body is fine now. There's still us here. You have to take good care of your body. After returning to High City, try to get pregnant as soon as possible. Previously you often moved the fetus. It's probably because this child is not fated with our Emo family. Mr. Emo still doesn't know what happened, so don't tell him. You and Jingshan are still young. There are too many women at your age who can't keep their babies after only 1 or 2 months. Jingshan's father and I are open-minded. As long as you take good care of your body, you can have another baby at any time. After all, you and Jingshan have always been so close. Hurry up and have another baby, so that Mr. Emo can be happy." Wanju said as she handed the peeled apple to Jinwan. "Jingshan doesn't have an appetite. Here, eat it." Jinwan took it, and kept a smile on her face. "Thank you. You've been keeping what happened to Jingshan in your heart. I didn't ask you to call me Mom, but it's been so long. Shouldn't you call me Mom?" Wanju smiled. Jinwan's expression faltered, and she glanced at the man on the sickbed. But all she saw was the same indifference as before. Emo Jingshan didn't even look at her from beginning to end. Kei was talking to him, and his eyes were on Kei. If it were in the past, if Wanju asked her to call her mom, she would definitely do so. But now, even if she wanted to, she suddenly couldn't say it. Her throat was a little dry, and when she saw that Emo Jingshan didn't even look at her, she couldn't help clenching the apple in her hand. "Oh, look at me. I was too happy these days and forgot that there are too many people here. You must be embarrassed. Let's talk about it when we get home." Wanju took Jinwan's hand with a smile. "Jingshan plans to go back to High City next week. Although the doctor said he's fine, I'm still worried. Remember to call me when you go back with him, and tell me about his condition. And you've been too thin recently. You must put on a few pounds." Jinwan nodded. Jinwan just nodded and couldn't say a word. Wanju suddenly leaned over to Emo Jingshan and said something. But from the way she looked at Jinwan from time to time, Jinwan guessed that she was asking Emo Jingshan to treat Jinwan well, and have another child as soon as possible. Emo Jingshan didn't respond, and Wanju just thought it was inconvenient for him to be too friendly to Jinwan, because there were too many people here. So she didn't take it seriously. The ward was very lively, and Jinwan hadn't felt such a lively atmosphere for a long time. Then Emo Jingshan suddenly coughed in a low voice, and she subconsciously put down the apple in her hand, turned around, and quickly poured him a glass of water. Emo Jingshan looked at the glass of water she handed him, and didn't take it. "I don't want to drink it. Take it away." Jinwan's hand holding the glass froze awkwardly on the spot. The author's words: 1. The male lead is not dead, nor is he reborn. He just knows a lot of things about his previous life, and many things that the female lead doesn't know. Both of them have the memories of 2 lives, and they are complete. 2. Neither of their characters has collapsed, and the plot is still the same as when I wrote the Cambodia novel. It's a plot I've set up in my outline. I'm used to holding back. Although this may cause me to lose some readers who are impatient or can't stand the abuse, thank you for your support, but I still stick to my writing direction. There's no need to tell me in the comments and on Weibo that you're giving up writing. Reading is like watching TV series. If you like it, watch it every day. If you don't, just turn it off. If you're happy, I'm happy. If you're not, I'm not happy. 3. I don't like spoilers, but Emo Tiantan is still the old Emo Tiantan. He just has some memories. For Jinwan, He can even risk his life. How can he not love her when he wakes up? Chapter 368. Wonju took the glass of water and said with a smile, "You're really my daughter-in-law. You just won't drink it. You don't even say a word of courtesy." With that, she put the glass aside and turned to look at Jinwan. "Sit down and rest. We'll take care of Jingshan. When you return to High City, you'll take care of him. Don't worry." At this time, Qin Sighting entered the ward and said after hearing their conversation, "He's fine now. As long as the occasional headache subsides, he'll be fine. Even if he returns to High City, he doesn't need special care. After all, he has been asleep for 2 months. Everything that should be healed has been healed." Wonju nodded happily. "That's great. Otherwise, I won't feel at ease to let them go back." Jinwan didn't sit down, but took 2 steps back to stand by the window. Qin Sighting said a few more words to Wonju and turned to look at her. "Jinwan, come here and help me get the medicine." Okay. Jinwan was really at a loss in this ward. If there were no one else here, she might have a chance to talk to Mo Jingshan. But now she couldn't even get a word in. After leaving the ward, Qin Sighting walked in front, and she followed behind. When she went to get the medicine, Qin Sighting glanced back at her. "What exactly happened between the two of you?" "Nothing. Just a small matter. It'll be all right after we return to High City." Jinwan lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes at all, and she was obviously not telling the truth. Seeing that she didn't intend to tell him the truth, Qin Sighting didn't ask any more curiously. He handed the medicine to her and patted her on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself. Don't be like me. Love is the most difficult thing to deal with." Jinwan nodded. In her previous life, she was too troublesome. She caused so much trouble in front of Mo Jingshan that he lost all his tolerance and patience for her. The current Mo Jingshan was the Mo Jingshan she had once single-handedly created. A Mo Jingshan who was far beyond her reach. The Mo Jingshan now was so strange that she couldn't feel at ease. He obviously doesn't intend to let his parents know about the current situation between you and him. It seems peaceful here in Los Angeles, but when he returns to High City, I'm afraid many things will be under his control. You'd better be prepared. Although Qin Sighting felt it was cruel, he still said it. "I know, but I won't divorce him, never," Jinwan said softly. Qin Sighting raised his eyebrows. "I hope you can hold on." 4 days later, Mo Jingshan was discharged. 3 days later, it would be time for him to return to High City. Mo Jingshan immediately booked a flight back to High City. 3 days after he was discharged from the hospital, after Wonju's repeated persuasion, he finally agreed to stay at the Mo family for a few days. On the day of discharge, the weather was very cold and windy. Many people who had been difficult to enter the ward to visit were waiting in front of the hospital, including the people who settled down. Father and said to Mo Xiaozi with a smile, "Young people are always in good health. After such a big accident, he will recover after a good rest for 2 months, unlike us, who are old and can't even recover from a fall." Mo Xiaozi smiled. "You're right. We have to accept our old age. Our physical quality is different from that of young people." Father and went to greet Mo Jingshan, and Mo Jingshan nodded to him. They had just walked down the stairs in front of the hospital, and there was still a long way to go to the parking place. Jinwan felt the wind was too strong. She had brought Mo Jingshan's coat, which was in the bag in Kay's hand. Jinwan turned to take the coat from Kay, and quickly came to Mo Jingshan's side. She was about to put the coat on him, but Mo Jingshan took a step forward calmly and avoided the coat she was about to put on him, as if he didn't see her. Jinwan paused and was about to move forward when she suddenly heard Shuyan say, "Jingshan, put on a coat. The wind is too strong." As she spoke, Shuyan placed a dark gray coat on Mo Jingshan's back. It was unclear if it was newly bought, or if she had gone to the Mo family to retrieve it. Mo Jingshan didn't avoid it, and his face was calm, showing no sign of refusal or dissatisfaction. Jinwan stopped and stood behind the crowd. At this moment, almost no one paid attention to her, and she was the only one who could feel this little indifference and neglect. "Mrs. Mo, this coat." Kay came over and handed the bag to her. "Why don't you put it in first?" Jinwan handed the coat to Kay, and turned to see that Shuyan was in the crowd. Since she put the coat on Jingxian, she had been walking beside him. When they came to the car door, she raised her hand to help him. When the man's slender figure got into the car, his arm was held by Shuyan, and he didn't move it away. The feeling that a big piece of her heart had been dug out came again. When everyone left, got in the car, and finally got into the car Jingxian took, Jingxian had closed his eyes and sat silently on the leather chair in the car. She didn't know whether he was asleep or just taking a nap, but he didn't look at Jinwan from beginning to end, as if he didn't care when she got in the car, or whether she got in the car or not. This was a high-end limousine, and it was very stable. Right now there were many people sitting in the car. Although the Em family did not come up, Jingxian was still wearing the coat Shu Qian had draped over him. Wan, is there anything you want to buy? If not, let's go back to the Mo family. You and Jingxian can have a good rest at the Mo family these days before going back to High City, Wanzhu asked in the car. No. Wanzhu signaled the driver to drive. She didn't think there was anything wrong with Jingxian, who was more quiet and indifferent than usual since he woke up, as if he was thousands of miles away from people. On the contrary, Jinwan was much quieter these days. When they were about to return to the Mo family, Wanzhu took the servant who came with her to buy something, saying that she would make soup for them when they got back. Mo Xiaozi was not in this car, and the driver was also asked by Wanzhu to help carry the things. After they got out of the car, only Jinwan and Jingxian were left. It was quiet in the car. In the past few days after Jingxian woke up, his ward had been filled with people. She didn't know if the usually quiet man was deliberately trying to avoid spending time with her alone, but he allowed so many people to wander around his ward. So it was not until now that the two of them had a chance to be alone again. Chapter 369. However, before she could find a topic, Jingxian, who had been sitting there with his eyes closed, spoke. We'll talk about the divorce when we return to High City. There's no need to mention it here. He did not open his eyes, but his indifferent voice was directed at Jinwan. Jinwan's face paled. Why do we have to divorce? At this time, the man opened his eyes, but there was no warmth in his indifferent eyes, cold and dark. Haven't we divorced before? But we haven't. The past is in the past for me. I only recognize the present. Jinwan looked at him and said firmly, I won't divorce. The man looked at her coldly. His distant and indifferent eyes were like icy thorns. Jinwan slowly clenched her hands and suddenly asked, did you really marry another woman? She did not dare to ask whether it was Shuyan, Ji Mingran, or anyone else. Just this tentative question had torn her heart into pieces, and she could barely put it back together. The man's black eyes looked at her, and gradually emitted traces of mockery. What do you think? 4 simple words chilled Jinwan's heart to the bottom. Was he admitting it, or was he simply mocking her? She couldn't understand these words at all. Just like the current Jingxian, she couldn't understand him at all. This man was not a simple person to begin with, and now he was even more unfathomable and difficult to understand. She was silent for a moment, slowly clenched her hands on her lap, and insisted, I won't divorce Jingxian. Whether in America or back to High City, I won't divorce. The man looked at her coldly, and did not speak again. At this time, the car door had been opened. When Jinwan looked at him again, she saw that he had closed his eyes to rest again. Obviously, he did not intend to waste time on such a useless topic and quarrel with her. He didn't even want to say a word to her. Los Angeles, the Mo family. It was noon when they arrived at the Mo family home. The servants had prepared lunch. No one else followed them. When they got out of the car and walked into the Mo family home, they were alone. Ms. Wanzhu, who had been in a good mood all the way, entered the door with the servants carrying shopping bags. You've been eating hospital meals or takeout from nearby hotels these days. It's been a long time since you had a good meal at home. Hurry up and eat, Wanzhu said as she handed the shopping bags into the kitchen and told the servants to wash the bought ingredients. She would find time in the afternoon to cook. Then Wanzhu looked back at Jinwan, who seemed to be waiting for the elders to sit down. She smiled, walked over, and sat down, and motioned for Jinwan to sit next to Jingxian. Jinwan glanced at Emo Jingshan before sitting down, only to see that the man was just sitting there silently and didn't look at her. Since he said he wouldn't mention the divorce in the Emo family, he probably didn't intend to keep too much distance from her. She hesitated for a moment and then sat down beside him. However, the distance between the dining chairs and their bodies was only about half a meter, but it felt like 10 years had passed. Beside her was a person that she could never reach, even if she exhausted both of her lives. The servants served the lunch that they had prepared, filling up the entire table. Jinwan put a bowl of the medicated diet specially made for her and Emo Jingshan, and put it in front of Emo Jingshan. Emo Jingshan glanced at it and didn't take it. Jingshan, get some chicken soup for Jinwan. She needs nourishment. Even if we go back to High City, ask Auntie Chen to make chicken soup for her every few days. It's best if it's black chicken soup. It's very good for women. Wanju said and winked at Emo Jingshan. Really, this guy used to love his wife so much, but after sleeping for 2 months, he seemed to have become dull in love. Not only did he not spoil Jinwan as passionately as before, but he didn't even give her a bowl of chicken soup that was so close to his hand. Emo Jingshan didn't seem to hear her. Jinwan smiled to ease her embarrassment. No, I've drunk a lot these days. My mouth is almost spoiled by you. Don't you have more in the evening? I'll drink your soup tonight. This child, you're so sweet. You want to drink my soup, don't you? Then I'll make more for you tonight. Jinwan nodded, picked up a piece of fish tofu that was very close to her hand, and put it in Emo Jingshan's bowl. Emo Jingshan hadn't lifted his chopsticks yet. When their chopsticks collided, Jinwan saw that the fish tofu fell directly into his bowl, and was about to take back her chopsticks. However, the man suddenly put down the chopsticks in his hand, and said indifferently, "Bring me another pair of chopsticks." Jinwan. A minute later, she watched the man use the new pair of chopsticks to pick out the fish tofu she had just picked up and didn't eat it. Only then did Wanju and Emo Xiaoza notice that there seemed to be something wrong between the two of them, but they just thought that the young couple might be quarreling. They didn't care about or participate in this kind of quarrel between husband and wife, so they didn't ask more questions, but just smiled and asked them to eat more to nourish their bodies. Then Jinwan didn't continue to put food in Emo Jingshan's bowl. She ate some silently and put down the bowl, unable to eat anymore. Why do you eat so little? Wanju asked. It's a lot. Jinwan didn't have an appetite, and now her appetite was even worse because of her mood. You've lost weight recently. Although I persuaded you to go back to the Emo family to rest in the days before Jingshan woke up, you ate very little every day. I felt sorry for you when I saw you didn't eat or sleep well. Now that Jingshan is fine, why do you still eat so little? Wanju said as she put some more food in Jinwan's bowl. Good girl, eat more. You can't lose weight like this. Jinwan had to eat a little more, but she really couldn't eat anymore, and put down the chopsticks after a few more mouthfuls. At this time, Emo Jingshan got up to answer the phone. Jinwan sat at the table and was about to get up, when Wanju suddenly asked in a voice that only she could hear. Did you quarrel with Jingshan? Jinwan paused and shook her head. No, if it was just a quarrel, it would be fine. But now Emo Jingshan didn't even want to quarrel with her. Wanju had obviously seen Emo Jingshan treat Jinwan so well a while ago, but now he suddenly treated Jinwan coldly. Although she felt it was a little strange to see Emo Jingshan being so cold in front of his wife, she still comforted Jinwan. Don't take it to heart. It's inevitable that there will be friction between husband and wife. Be patient. If Jingshan bullies you after returning to High City, call me and I'll fly over to help you. Chapter 370. In the afternoon, Emo Jingshan and Emo Xiaoza talked about Shine Group, while Jinwan followed Wanju around the Emo home. In the evening, she went to the kitchen with Wanju to pick vegetables. The servants of the Emo family were used to the hostess taking the initiative to go to the kitchen. They cleaned up everything in the kitchen and let the two of them work as much as they wanted. After dinner, Jinwan went back to the bedroom. She wanted to wait for Emo Jingshan to come back to have a good talk with him, but after waiting for a long time, he didn't return to the bedroom. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening, so Jinwan had to go to the bathroom to take a shower. Halfway through the shower, she vaguely heard the bedroom door open and close. Her heart paused, knowing that Mo Jingxian had come in. She didn't dawdle, sped up the shower, wrapped herself in a bath towel, and went straight out of the bathroom. As soon as she went out, she saw the man standing neatly dressed in the bedroom. Apparently, he turned his eyes because he heard the sound in the bathroom. When he saw the bath towel on Jinwan, his eyes were cold. "Put on your clothes and then come out." Jinwan. They had been married for so long. Wasn't it normal to come out with a bath towel wrapped around her? She used to be carried into the bathroom after being harshly bullied by him on the bed. And then he carried her out naked. What did she say at that time? Jinwan thought about it, picked up her clothes, went back to the bathroom, put on her pajamas, and blew her hair until it was half dry. When she came out, she saw that Mo Jingxian was standing in front of the bedroom window. Outside the window was a huge balcony. He didn't go out. His slender figure stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. His back was familiar but also strange. She ran her fingers through her half-dry hair and walked over. "Can we have a good talk? It's getting late. Go to sleep. I'll go to the study to deal with some business after taking a shower." Mo Jingxian didn't look at her. When Jinwan approached, he avoided her and turned to the study. Jinwan was silent for a moment and asked, "Aren't you going to sleep?" The man's back was cold and full of alienation. "You sleep on the bed. I'll sleep in the study." His answer was decisive and straightforward. And even the last connection between husband and wife with Jinwan seemed to be severed by him in an instant. The sound of water came from the bathroom. Jinwan was still standing in front of the window. She turned to look at the bathroom, and took a long time to calm down before she went to get 2 sets of clothes, walked over, and gently knocked on the bathroom door. The sound of water in the bathroom immediately stopped. "What is it?" The man's deep and cold voice came from inside. "You didn't take a change of clothes out. Put it at the door. It's a bit cold in the room. It's better to come out after you're done. I'll bring it in for you." "No need." For a moment, Jinwan heard a hint of decisiveness in his voice. She gritted her teeth. Today, she had been provoked by Mo Jingxian. "Are you afraid that you have too many wounds, and don't want me to see them? Or do you want to keep a distance from me to the point where we can't even be husband and wife?" There was silence in the bathroom, and the sound of water continued. Obviously, he had no intention of answering her. Jinwan angrily put his clothes down on the table in front of the door, and turned back to the bed. When she sat down on the bed, she did not lift the quilt to lie down, but just stared at the bathroom, listening to the sound of water in it. She was really angry, but she didn't know whether to be angry at herself for pushing this man so far away, or at Mo Jingxian, who could be so heartless now. Jinwan picked up her cell phone and flipped through it. The text messages she had sent him when he was unconscious were all read. He saw them all, but he didn't reply to her text messages, nor did he reply verbally. Was it because when he opened his eyes again, he had already remembered everything in the past? So when he saw her dozens of messages, it was as if he was watching a huge joke? When the sound of water stopped, Jinwan stared at the bathroom. Not long after, the man opened the door, took in a change of clothes and came out dressed. His hair had been dried, but it was still a little wet. His ink-black hair seemed to have a faint cold brilliance, as if Jinwan did not exist in this bathroom. After coming out, he went straight into the study. Jinwan remembered that when she had just been reborn, it wasn't easy for her to coax Mo Jingxian home from the company. But he also lived in the study, or slept in another bedroom. 10 years ago, they slept in separate rooms because she wanted a divorce, and he avoided her temper and let her sleep alone. As long as she changed her ideas and practices, and tried to cherish the life with him, the pace of their marriage would slowly return to happiness and stability. But 10 years later, they had divorced and hadn't seen each other for 10 years. How could she stand by Mo Jingxian's side? He had long been the global executive president of the Shine Group, a superior who was much more powerful than the Mo Corporation. His calmness, indifference, heartlessness, and means were definitely more unpredictable than what he had been 10 years ago. He controlled everything, but no one could control him anymore. The Mo Jingxian she knew was him, But now Emo Jingshan had become the one she was extremely unfamiliar with. She couldn't understand, let alone understand. The two of them were very close, but they seemed to be separated by thousands of mountains and rivers. The door of the study was closed. She couldn't see inside, but she really couldn't sleep, so she sat on the bed and took out a box of burn ointment from the drawer. She had never had the patience to apply this thing. The doctor also said that the burn marks on her hands would disappear naturally in a few months. If she insisted on applying this ointment, they would disappear faster. She slowly applied the ointment on her hands, and a faint medicinal fragrance came into her nose. She stared at her hands and suddenly couldn't remember when was the last time she held hands with Emo Jingshan. It seemed that it had been a long time. Last time, at that dinner party, he had been holding her hand tightly and keeping her by his side, never far away. But at this moment, not to mention holding hands, even touching chopsticks made him want to change to a new pair. As if she were a plague. Even when they slept, they didn't sleep in the same room. Jinwan resisted the throbbing pain in her heart. Considering that Emo Jingshan had just been discharged from the hospital and needed to rest in a comfortable bed more than she did, she got up and sat down on the fabric sofa in the bedroom. After looking at her phone for a while, she looked up at the door of the study, which was closed and quiet. It was like an insurmountable barrier. Chapter 371. For some reason, Jinwan felt as though everything had returned to the past. She opened her eyes in a daze, watching the person so close to her. After a long while she gradually woke up. When she raised her eyes again, she saw the man's gaze on her. It was a very, very faint gaze. She did not know how long he had been standing here, and how long he had been watching her. "Are you done?" She resisted the urge to lean into his arms at such a close distance, and asked sleepily, "Why didn't you sleep on the bed?" The man's low and cold voice was even colder than the night outside the window. Jinwan woke up again, and tugged the thin blanket covering her. She was still curled up on the sofa, but because she had just woken up, her nasal voice was very heavy. "You've just been discharged from the hospital. It shouldn't be comfortable to sleep in the study, so I'll let you sleep on the bed." The man silently watched her for a moment and said calmly, "In my upbringing, there's no such thing as a man sleeping on the bed and a woman sleeping on the sofa. Go back to the bed." The first sentence was somewhat distant and polite, but the last sentence was like a command. It was very similar to the Emo Jingshan, who usually urged her to eat and sleep. Jinwan was quiet. She gripped the corner of the blanket, her voice slightly hoarse. "Between us, when did we reach the point where we need to be so polite?" The man's pitch-black and calm eyes watched her quietly. "Otherwise, do you want to sleep on the bed with me? Or do you want something to happen between us tonight? We're husband and wife, aren't we?" Jinwan directly looked into his eyes. However, the man's indifferent gaze quickly made her realize that she was being unrequited. "I'm afraid you haven't found your place." The man's unique cold fragrance was right in front of her, but after saying this, he directly turned and walked away. Finally, the door to the study opened and closed. Jinwan curled up on the sofa, watching the door and then turning to look at the empty bed. During this period, Emo Jingshan and Jinwan were like strangers. However, the Emo family gradually exerted pressure on the Su family, causing the Su family to seal off the news. Even Elder Su could not control the invisible net that was being cast on his granddaughter. When Elder Su could no longer bear it, and directly came to the Emo family, Emo Jingshan did not avoid him. However, there was a hint of a smile in his dark eyes. This smile was unfathomable. He had always been a person that Elder Su could not understand and deal with. At this moment, he especially felt that Emo Jingshan, who had only woken up after sleeping for 2 whole months, seemed to be even more decisive and ruthless than before. "Shui has already died in that car. This case can't be closed just like that. Do you really want to fight to the death with our Su family?" Elder Su looked at Emo Xiaoza, who had gradually found out the truth, and then at Emo Jingshan. He gritted his teeth and tried to fight for more opportunities for Su Jilan. However, Emo Jingshan only coldly curved his lips. Everything went on as usual. In the days after Emo Jingshan woke up, the The Su family had been turned upside down. When Elder Su wanted to come again, he could no longer see Mo Jingshan. The Mo family's door and Shine's door had also clearly forbidden the Su family. In the 3 days before returning to High City, the evidence that Su Jilan had hired a hitman to kill Su Jilan was more accurately confirmed. All the medicine Su Shiwei had taken before her death, all the hospital diagnoses, and all the evidence related to Su Jilan's plan were laid out one by one. In the face of the Mo family's means and evidence, Elder Su was powerless. Su Jilan was grounded in the Su family as a suspect and taken to the police station. All the evidence of the crime was presented one by one. She could not defend herself no matter how hard she tried to find an excuse. Knowing that the real murderer behind the scenes might really be Su Jilan, Su Shui's parents flew into a rage and ran to the police station to expose many things of the Su family, including many things between Su Jilan and Su Shui. Jinwan lost a child. So within a week after Mo Jingshan woke up, the Su family completely changed. Su Jilan was convicted. Elder Su was so angry that he fell into a coma and was sent to the hospital for emergency treatment. Su Shui was finally able to leave the Forensic Institute and was taken home by her parents to be buried. Mo Jingshan's swift and decisive actions, as well as his precise judgment and means, made Mo Xiaozi feel ashamed of his inferiority. He asked him several times when he would come back to take over Shine. In the past, Mo Jingshan would never answer this question. Before returning to High City, Mo Jingshan watched Jinwan get into the car and said after a long time, "Don't touch my people. In 2 years, the Mo Corporation will merge with Shine, and 2 years later, I will take over Shine." Mo Xiaozi raised his eyebrows and looked at him abruptly. "Are you sure?" Mo Jingshan's cold voice gradually became full of sarcasm. "If I don't come back to take over Shine in 2 years, I'm afraid that with the prestige you have built up and the penetration rate in recent years, you won't be able to resist the attack of the 2 internet companies, VK and Huahong. Give me 2 years, and they will collapse in front of the Mo Corporation. They won't even be qualified to compete with Shine." Although Shine was the largest Chinese company in the Chinese world in the United States, in recent years, there have been major changes in the domestic and foreign industries, and many of them were turning to the internet and technology. At his age, Mo Xiaozi didn't know much about these things, and his penetration rate was very low. If Shine continued to be in his hands, in a few years, it would fall in the torrent of these industry changes sooner or later. It was not as promising as the Mo Corporation that Mo Jingshan had supported, so it was indeed the best choice for Mo Corporation to merge with Shine and let Mo Jingshan take over. However, Mo Jingshan had never given a direct response, so Mo Xiaozi had always thought that he would never take over Shine and had been worried whether the Mo family's century-old foundation would be destroyed in his hands. And now, Mo Jingshan's words had put Mo Xiaozi's mind at ease. When they got on the plane back to High City at the same time as Mo Jingshan, Feng Ling had a mission in the United States and would go to High City to see Jinwan after a while. The plane had been flying for several hours. The blue sky and white clouds outside the window looked so beautiful, but the man beside Jinwan remained silent. The two boarded the plane together in front of Wanzhou and Mo Xiaozi. After getting on the plane, the man didn't say a word to her. Chapter 372. Mo Jingshan recovered quickly. Perhaps sleeping motionlessly like this for 2 months really left a lot of space for the wounds on his body to heal, unlike before, when his wounds were torn open at any time. Now, except that he was a little thinner than when he was in High City, he was no different from before. He was still as cold and noble as she remembered, and still the man she was familiar with. The only difference was that he no longer smiled at her, and his gaze no longer lingered on her. Even though they were sitting on the same plane, even though the two of them were sitting in the same row, and he was right next to her, it felt like they were very, very far apart. Jinwan sat for a while, and suddenly put her hand on his leg. The man opened his eyes and stared at her with heavy eyes. "What are you doing?" Jinwan looked at her hand on his leg, and then at his displeased, heavy eyes. She pursed her lips and said, "Excuse me, I want to go to the bathroom." Even though the first-class seats were spacious, he was tall and had long legs, and he was sitting on the outside of the aisle. If he didn't step aside, she wouldn't be able to go out at all. Emo Jingshan took another look at her and moved his leg away. Jin Wan withdrew her hand resentfully. When she got up, the plane must have passed through an area with turbulence. Perhaps unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally, Jin Wan staggered and fell into his arms. Although she didn't fall so hard, she still pressed her hands on his legs and leaned forward, almost leaning into his arms, and their faces were only a finger's distance apart. At such a distance, the man looked at her deadpan. Jin Wan's heart pounded, but she said calmly, "Sorry, I didn't stand still." Emo Jingshan. Before getting up, Jin Wan's hand purposely pressed down hard on his thigh. She pressed down hard on this golden thigh that she was not allowed to touch earlier before getting up. She turned and went to the private restroom not far from the first-class cabin. Standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, Jin Wan smiled at the mirror. She felt that her smile was not very good, so she raised her hand to pull up the corners of her mouth. She didn't put down her hand until she was satisfied with it. They were going back to High City, back to their original world, their original life. Divorce? Of course she wouldn't. But if she kept being alienated by him like this, it seemed that she couldn't maintain the status quo forever. In this marriage, self-esteem, face and strength were not important. Besides, Emo Jingshan had done everything for her, whether she was aware of it or not. Not long ago, he had almost died for her. If she compromised and left so easily now, she would really let him and herself down. Since they were husband and wife, it was a legal relationship. At most, he would let her chase after him. If he retreated, she would advance. If he was cold, she would warm. If he avoided, she would take the initiative. If he was expressionless, she would smile. As Mrs. Emo, couldn't she climb into his bed legally? As long as she wanted to take the initiative, no matter how powerful he was, he would not be able to remove her from the spouse column unless she agreed to a divorce. Jin Wan smiled at the mirror for a while. Feeling that her smile was natural and beautiful, she walked out. When she returned to her seat, the moment Emo Jingshan got up, Jin Wan happened to walk past him. She looked up at his cold face and suddenly stood on tiptoe to whisper in his ear, "Honey, after several days of careful consideration, I've finally made up my mind." Hearing this, the man glanced at her calmly, his eyes a little like looking at a lunatic. Jin Wan had prepared herself and was ready to fight back. Facing his eyes, she smiled and looked into his quiet black eyes, saying in a low voice, "I've decided. Even if you put a knife to my neck, I won't agree to divorce you." The man was expressionless just now, but because of her words he became as cold as usual. Without waiting for him to speak, Jin Wan slipped back to her seat, fastened her seat belt, picked up a magazine in front of her, and flipped through it, looking forward to flying back to High City as soon as possible. Emo Jingshan didn't say anything, and on the plane, he didn't intend to discuss too much with her about a divorce. After reading the magazine for a while, Jin Wan patted him and asked him to ask the flight attendant for a glass of water, a blanket, or a headset. Almost every half an hour, she would try to talk to him, although the man always turned a blind eye to her. Jin Wan still happily patted his hand after half an hour. Emo Jingshan's expression became colder, and he glanced at her. Jin Wan put the magazine in front of him solemnly, pointed to the French paragraph on the last page of the magazine, and asked, "I haven't learned French, so I don't know this. Don't you know many languages? What's this paragraph about?" The man looked at her clumsy acting skills and pure attitude of trying to find something to talk about, and completely ignored her. Jin Wan pointed to the French paragraph and asked, "Just translate it into Chinese for me. I don't think it's very long. It's just 2 or 3 sentences at most." Emo Jingshan glanced at the words she was pointing at. His gaze deepened, but he did not translate it for her. The plane would land in High City in about 3 hours. Jin Wan kept looking at the passage. On the other side of the aisle sat a French student with a Chinese-French dictionary in his hand. Jin Wan borrowed the dictionary and read it word by word. Finally, she took a pen and wrote down the translated content on her boarding pass. Koi kill spas impersonatary element, Ella revian dratager save cledumps. No matter what happens, if someone truly loves you, as time passes, she will eventually come back. Jean Wan returned the dictionary to the French student, and then placed the words she had just written in front of Mo Jingshan. She looked at him with a burning gaze. Did I translate it correctly? Mo Jingshan glanced at the row of beautiful words she had written on the boarding pass, and did not speak for a long time. His gaze was cold and indifferent. In the end, when Jean Wan approached to ask him, he looked at her. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, enough to cut her. His tone was indifferent. There are many ways to interpret French. People who think they're passionate will usually translate a simple sentence into something extremely romantic. In short, it's all because they're passionate. Chapter 373. High City. It had only been a few short months, but it felt like half a lifetime ago. As soon as he returned, Mo Jingshan went straight to the Mo Corporation. He did not even return to the U Garden, nor did he ask about Jean Wan. Jean Wan returned to the U Garden to tidy up and planned to go to the Ji home. Before returning, she learned that Ji Hongwen had been discharged. Recently, the Ji Corporation had been handed over to the vice president to manage, and Ji Hongwen would most likely be resting at home for a while. Before returning to the Ji home, she called Mo Jingshan, only to find that his private number was turned off. Not many people called his private number. Even if grandfather Mo wanted to call him, he would usually call his work number, office phone, or directly call the U Garden's landline. This number was usually used to contact her. She called Shen Mu, only to learn that Mo Jingshan went straight to the conference room after going to the company. He had not returned for a long time, and there were many problems waiting for him to deal with. Jean Wan did not receive Mo Jingshan's call the entire afternoon. Even when Shen Mu told him that she had called, he did not call her back. Before the sky turned dark, Jean Wan returned to the Ji family. Ji Hongwen's health was much better. Ever since she went to T-City, she hadn't been back for about half a year. There was still no news from Ji Menggran. It had only been half a year, but Ji Hongwen seemed to have aged 10 years. Shen Mu said that CEO Mo would most likely have a meeting tonight. It was uncertain if it would end before noon tomorrow, so she did not plan to return tonight, and simply stayed at the Ji home to accompany Ji Hongwen. Shen Haru had already been chased away. It was said that not long after she was chased away, she was picked up by Sheng Yihan. As expected, this pair of mother and son had not truly severed their mother-son relationship after so many years. Ji Hongwen still needed to rest for a while. Jean Wan found that he would watch the aviation news before going to bed. Although he did not say it, Ji Menggran was his biological daughter after all. She had been missing for so long without any news, and it had not been confirmed that she had really died. He had always been worried about her. Therefore, she also checked the news before going to bed, and found that Ji Menggran really seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was no news of her anywhere. Her name was not on the list of victims of the plane crash. Even at the airline press conference, no one mentioned her name. Mo Jingshan held meetings in the company for several days, and Jean Wan stayed at the Ji home for a few days. Ji Hongwen was able to get out of bed occasionally because of her return and company. When spring came, he would often walk around the front yard with Jean Wan's help, or sit in a wheelchair and be pushed by Jean Wan to the nearby shopping malls, supermarkets, parks, and other places to relax. A week later, Ji Hongwen's physical and mental condition were much better, and he decided to return to the company after a few more days of rest. Jean Wan took some time to go to the studio. In the evening, she was dragged downstairs by Xia Tian and Xiao Ba to eat a lot of food, and her stomach was almost bursting. After returning to the U Garden by car, Auntie Chen asked her if she wanted to eat. Jean Wan rubbed her stomach and shook her head. No, I ate too much at night. Now I can't even drink a mouthful of water. Auntie Chen smiled and asked her to take advantage of the good weather tonight, to take a stroll in the U Garden to digest. However, Jean Wan knew that Mo Jingshan did not continue the meeting today, and thought that he would return to the U Garden today. But she went upstairs and searched all the bedrooms, but found no trace of him. Hasn't Mo Jingshan come back these days? Jean Wan asked. No. He hasn't come back these days when I'm not here. No. It had been a week since he returned to High City. He could attend meetings and work overtime. But since there was no meeting today, he didn't even plan to return to the U Garden? Was he trying to avoid the opportunity to meet her? Jinwon thought about it. Although she didn't know if he was really busy, and she was not the kind of person who was particularly used to calling often, she still picked up her cell phone and called Mo Jingshan. His private number was still turned off. She dialed the number of his studio. The phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. But now it was time to get off work, and Jinwon couldn't disturb Shinmu at this time. She hesitated, and without taking off her coat or changing her shoes, she turned and went out. Hey Mrs. Mo, you just came back, and you're leaving again? Auntie Chen finally saw the hostess of the house come back. Seeing Jinwon turn and leave again, she was worried and hurriedly chased after her to ask. I'll go to the Mo Corporation to have a look, Jinwon replied, went straight to the parking lot, and drove out by herself. Seeing Jinwon drive the car away, Auntie Chen stood on the spot inside. Although Mrs. Mo didn't live in the U Garden these days, if it were in the past, Mr. Mo would definitely find time to call back and ask if Jinwon had returned to the U Garden. However, these days, Jinwon returned to the Ji family, but Mr. Mo not only didn't return to the U Garden, but also didn't even call. The white Audi sped along the road. It didn't take long to drive to the Mo Corporation. Jinwon stopped the car, got out of the car, and closed the door. She stood in the square opposite the Mo Corporation building for a while, looking at the top floor, which was not lit. She hesitated before walking in. She went to the company's security room and asked if Mo Jingshan was in the company. The security guard knew Jinwon and knew that she was Mrs. Mo, so he answered truthfully, CEO Mo is not in the company. Not in the company? Then where did he go? I saw his car was still there. Jinwon glanced at the familiar black ghost in the parking lot. CEO Mo has been in meetings for several days in a row, and it's rare for him to take a break today. He planned to live in the office break room. But some time ago, the office glass on each floor of the company was reinforced, and some simple new decoration was carried out. There may be some smell of solidified glue, so CEO Mo didn't live here. Okay, thank you. Jinwon didn't ask more, turned to walk down the steps, and then looked in the direction of Aolon International, which was not far from the Mo Corporation. As far as she knew, apart from the U Garden, the only place where he lived was Aolon International. If he didn't drive, only Aolon International was the nearest place. She didn't continue driving. Instead, she turned around and walked in that direction. When she crossed the road, her eyes fell on the fruit store across the road. She then glanced at the supermarket below the apartment building and went in to buy some fruits and ingredients. When she was buying ingredients in the supermarket, she handed over the money to the shop owner. The shop owner clearly remembered her. After all, Mo Jingshan had come here with her. At that time, he bought some onions, ginger, and garlic and handed a black card to the proprietress. After shopping, Jinwon entered the apartment, entered the elevator, and went upstairs. When she arrived at the floor where Mo Jingshan lived, as soon as she walked out, she saw that the door of the apartment was closed. Although she knew the password and could unlock the door with her fingerprint, she still raised her hand and rang the doorbell. Chapter 374. The man was damp, handsome, and clean. It seemed that the coldness of these days had faded away in an instant. His hair was half wet, and his eyes were calm, and he seemed to have become the old Mo Jingshan again. However, the moment he saw that the person standing outside the door was her, his eyes turned cold. What are you doing here? Obviously, he had been busy in the company for several days, and held meetings for several days. He should have just returned to Aolon International to rest. There was more or less some fatigue in his eyes, but the coldness in his black eyes was as cold as ever. Auntie Chen said you haven't been back to the U Garden these days. I know you haven't been back to the company for a long time, and have a lot of things to deal with. You must be busy and tired these days. Just now, I passed by your company and heard that you had left, so I guessed you should be here, so I bought some food and necessities. You must have come back in a hurry, and didn't buy them. Jinwan said and showed him the shopping bag in her hand. Mo Jingshan's eyes swept over her face indifferently. Because of her passing by, he seemed to be a little sarcastic, but he didn't expose her. Can I come in? The man was silent for 2 seconds and said coldly, if I say no, will you leave now? Of course I won't leave. Then she saw the man's slightly mocking expression, and then he turned and walked in. Although he left the door open for her, he didn't mean to welcome her. At the moment he turned around, Jinwan finally saw the wounds on his back. Although the wounds had already healed, there were still scars left behind, regardless of whether it was light or heavy. She didn't know how long it would take for these wounds and scars to disappear, but each of them had left an indelible mark in Jinwan's life. No matter how he treated her now, he was Mo Jingshan, her Mo Jingshan. How could she give up so easily? And how could she escape because of these little setbacks? Jinwan went straight into the door. Nothing in Aolan International had changed. That's right. She hadn't lived here for so long, and he hadn't come back either. Usually, there wouldn't be any changes except that someone would come and clean the place. Mo Jingshan went back to the bathroom to continue drying his hair. Jinwan took the things she bought into the kitchen, and when she came out, Mo Jingshan had entered the bedroom. He didn't even look at her, as if her arrival was like a servant or a nanny who had just come back from shopping, and he didn't need to worry about asking or answering a word or half a sentence. Jinwan simply asked him through the bedroom door, have you finished all the work that has piled up in the company? The bedroom was quiet. There was no response. Jinwan asked again, when do you plan on returning to the Yew Garden? Not long after, the bedroom door opened, and the tall and slender man came out. He was no longer only wearing a bath towel. He had put on a shirt and black pants. Jinwan found that since he woke up, he seemed to be wearing black, and the light-colored or white shirts he occasionally wore were almost untouched. Was it because he was only used to wearing black in the following years? In the past, when he wore this color, he only looked noble and aloof, making it hard for people to get close to him. Now looking at him, it felt like he was a cold machine, emotionless and emotionless. It was like a black barrier had been erected between them, and she couldn't get close even if she wanted to. Because Jinwan had been staring at him, Mo Jingshan walked out of the bedroom and was about to pick up the phone. But because of her gaze, he turned to look at her. It was a very indifferent look, as if he was troubled by the sudden appearance of another person in his place. You've been here, and you've seen it. Why don't you leave? It's raining outside. I've lived here before, and even the password is my birthday. I'll stay here with you tonight, can't I? Jinwan asked in a matter-of-fact tone. Mo Jingshan looked out of the window. High City had entered spring, and the spring rain was biting. Jinwan's body couldn't stand the cold, so it was best not to go out at this time. He didn't say more, put down the phone he had just picked up, and seemed to hesitate for half a second before picking it up again. At the same time, he picked up the suit jacket on the sofa, put it in the crook of his arm, and straightened up to leave. Jinwan stared at his back and suddenly stepped forward. When he was about to go out, she suddenly jumped up to him, put her back against the door, and stared at him. Where are you going? Because of her actions, Mo Jingshan faintly furrowed his cold brows. Move aside. It's raining outside. Are you going out? You stay here. I'll go back to the company. Jinwan stared at him, and if her eyes could shoot fire, she really wanted to roast his frozen heart. Mo Jingshan, is there a virus in me? Do you have to hide from me like this? Although Aolan International is not the Yew Garden, it is also our common home, isn't it? You set the password of this apartment door by yourself. You set my birthday, which means you agree that this apartment belongs to the two of us. Now because I'm here you want to leave? The man pursed his lips indifferently and looked at her eyes that had been staring at him. I'll change the password. Jinwan widened her eyes. You want to change the password? Mo Jingshan didn't talk nonsense and said impatiently, get out of the way. I won't get out of the way. Jinwan stubbornly guarded the door. Do you want to leave? Do you want to keep a distance from me? All right. No matter how high the floor here is, it can't be as high as the 33rd floor. If you have the ability, jump down or climb down yourself. Anyway, I even dared to climb up to the 33rd floor. To avoid me, What's there to be afraid of? Go jump down yourself. Go jump. I won't stop you. The man's eyes were fixed on her face. Perhaps because of her words, he was silent for a few seconds, but after a few seconds, he still looked cold and ruthless. Jinwan, pestering me won't do you any good. Don't be so unreasonable. I'm protecting my marriage. I'm stopping my man from leaving me. Is this pestering? Mo Jingshan, I'm your wife. Soon I won't be, he said indifferently. I've been too busy to deal with your problem these days. Now that you've come to find me, I'll go back to the company tomorrow morning and bring the divorce agreement to you. Remember to sign it. Jinwan looked at him and said clearly, I won't divorce you. Never. Chapter 375. You know that I wasn't completely in charge of that incident. You also know that I was under the influence of drugs, and my mental state wasn't very good. You also know that Ji Minggran was behind it. You know everything. Jinwan was not irritated by his words at all. Instead, she stared at his black eyes more seriously and said firmly, I didn't do anything evil or against my principles except that I tried to divorce you and did some unreasonable things that really made you angry. There's no reason for me to be rejected by you like this. No matter in the past or now, I'm your wife. Mo Jingshan, I won't agree to divorce you. She stood in front of the door and had no intention of moving away. Mo Jingshan looked at her silently for a moment and didn't want to waste any more time with her. He turned around and threw his suit jacket back on the sofa. The rain was still falling outside the window. The pitter-patter of rain made this place even quieter. Life can't be repeated. You just have to treat everything that happened in the past 10 months as a dream. It's better for us to return to the beginning. He didn't want to argue with her, but he also didn't want to talk too much nonsense with her. How could it be a dream? The man I love is right in front of me. It hurts when you're hurt. It hurts when I pinch myself. You're right here. You're not a dream, and neither am I. Jinwan looked at his cold and resolute back. You're you, my husband. The man I love. You'd better agree to divorce. If you're afraid that the Ji family will go bankrupt, and that your studio can't afford your unknown life, I can transfer half of Mo Corporation's shares to your name. Even if. He paused. The Mo Jingshan of the past 10 months is the last gift I gave you. He said these words with his back to her. Jinwan couldn't see his expression, but could only hear the indifference and heartlessness in his tone. The Mo Jingshan of the past 10 months. Look how cleanly he brushed himself off. He spoke as if this person was not himself. It was too painful, really. Jinwan raised her finger and gently rubbed the corner of her eyes. She couldn't tell whether she was angry or sad. She pulled herself together and said, I definitely won't divorce. It's already so late, and I don't want to keep talking about this topic. I'm hungry. You haven't eaten since you came from the company, right? Let's eat, shall we? You eat by yourself. I'm not hungry. How could I not be hungry? You've always been so busy in the company that you forget to eat and sleep. You can't even avoid eating just because I'm here, right? I just bought some ingredients and fruits from the small supermarket downstairs. Since it's raining outside and we can't go out, why don't we cook something simple at home? The man unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt. His back was still facing her, and he didn't even look at her. Up to you. With that, he went straight to the study. Seeing him close the door of the study, Jinwan pursed her lips and stood in the living room looking at the door. She had brought all sorts of ingredients here, perhaps subconsciously thinking that Mo Jingshan would cook for her. But now, it seemed that he could only cook for her in his dreams, if she wanted him to cook for her again. What had gotten into her head that he would roll up his sleeves and go into the kitchen? Perhaps life hadn't given her enough blows to face the cruel reality, so she still had fantasies. But fortunately, he didn't leave and didn't really leave her here alone. She had to be content. Jinwan comforted herself, and then went into the kitchen alone. She washed her hands, washed the vegetables and prepared to cook. She wouldn't starve to death if she couldn't eat the dinner Mo Jingshan made himself. Although her cooking was much worse than his, she could eat. When she was in Cambodia, the little brothers of 11 Base all enjoyed the food she made. It didn't take long for Jinwan to cook 2 bowls of noodles. After all, it was getting late. and it would be a waste of time to cook other dishes. Cooking noodles was the fastest. After cooking, she put the chopped green onions, coriander, eggs, and other seasonings on one of the bowls into a lovely heart shape, and then went to the study with the heart-shaped bowl. She gently knocked on the door twice and went in. Mo Jingshan was reading company documents. Jinwan didn't disturb him. She walked over and put the bowl more than 20 centimeters away from his hand, then turned to look at his cold and silent profile while he was busy working, and whispered, "I cooked noodles. Have some." The man didn't respond, but she knew he heard her. She didn't say anything more, turned to go out, and gently closed the door of the study. No one accompanied her. At worst, she would eat alone. Jinwan quickly ate up her bowl of noodles, then took the initiative to clean up the kitchen, the refrigerator, and cut some fruit to eat. She cut the other half of the fruit and put it on another plate, planning to give it to Mo Jingshan when he came out. After all, it was not convenient to go in and disturb him. After taking a shower, Jinwan went to find a book to read. The man still didn't come out of the study, so she quietly read on the sofa in the living room. She seemed to have lived such a peaceful life before. In Aolan International, in the U Garden, in Tea City not long ago. One life, two people, three meals for seasons. In fact, this simplest and most ordinary life was the greatest happiness. The sky gradually darkened, and the rain outside stopped. There was not much rain in spring, but tonight's rain could be considered to have cooperated with Jinwan. It continued to rain when needed, and even in the dead of night, it became quiet, no longer making people's heads hurt. It was already past 12 o'clock at night. The lights in the living room were turned off, and there was only a floor lamp by the sofa. A light fell on her from the top of her head. Jinwan turned the page of the book in her hand and turned to look at the door of the study. The dinner was sent in at 8 o'clock. It should be reasonable for her to go in and take the bowl at this time. It shouldn't be a bother, right? She put down the book, got up from the sofa, went to the door of the study, and listened to the movement inside. She didn't know if Mo Jingshan had finished his work and was resting in the study, or he was still busy. There was no bed in the study of Aolan International, only a long sofa. Was he going to sleep in the study because she was here? There was more than one bedroom in Aolan International. He didn't have to suffer so much. Jinwan gently pushed the door open and saw that the light in the study was still on. The man who had been reading the documents of the company was still reading the documents in front of the computer and didn't pay attention to the sound of the study door being pushed open by her again. "Why aren't you sleeping?" Jinwan asked in a low voice. Knowing that he wouldn't answer her, Jinwan didn't wait for him to answer. She glanced at the table beside his hand and found that he hadn't eaten the bowl of noodles she sent in a few hours ago. Chapter 376. And the noodles were cold and completely lumped together. He hadn't even touched them in the past few hours. Jinwan suspected that he didn't even look at the bowl of noodles she brought in, let alone touch it or eat it. Even if he was hungry, he didn't intend to eat the food she made? Was it really so hard to cross the gap of 10 years between them? Jinwan didn't speak, but just looked at the man's back. She abruptly walked over, picked up the bowl of cold noodles, and turned to leave without saying a word. However, when she walked out of the study, she didn't control her strength, and the door of the study was slammed shut with a loud bang. The hand of the man in the study paused on the mouse for a moment. Then, without a trace, he continued with his previous work. Just 10 minutes later, the man got up and walked out of the study, just because he heard the sound of food. When he opened the door, he saw that Jinwan had put the bowl of cold and lumped noodles on the coffee table. She sat on the sofa, holding a pair of chopsticks and lowering her head to eat seriously. "What are you doing?" This was probably the first time Mo Jingshan had taken the initiative to speak to her since he woke up from his 2-month sleep. But there was still no warmth in his voice. Jinwan silently ate the bowl of cold and now quite unpalatable noodles. She ignored him and continued to pick up the noodles that could no longer be connected and stuffed them into her mouth. Mo Jingshan looked at her darkly, walked over, and moved the bowl of noodles away from her eyes. "The noodles are cold. What else do you want to eat?" Are you deliberately making things difficult for your stomach? Jinwan's expression was indifferent. She raised her hand to wipe the soup stains on the corner of her mouth and looked up at him. Even if you don't eat, your stomach is fine. I just ate a few bites of cold noodles. What can I do? Am I so fragile? I cooked the food you don't want to eat. If you don't want to eat it, I'll eat it myself. The man looked at her with almost incomprehensible eyes. Seeing Jinwan's firm expression, he frowned coldly, threw away the bowl of noodles, and didn't let her eat anymore. The noodles were gone, but Jinwan didn't say much. She put the chopsticks on the coffee table and sat on the sofa watching the man throw the empty bowl on the table. Mo Jingshan, are you afraid that I'll have a stomachache from eating something cold? Are you feeling sorry for me? She asked. The man didn't look at her. Some of the soup had splashed on his hand. He pulled out a tissue from the coffee table and wiped his hands expressionlessly. At the same time, he said expressionlessly, I don't want you to get a stomach problem and call the doctor tomorrow morning because of a stomachache. It'll waste my time. Is it so hard to admit that you can't let go of me? Jinwan stared at her. A mocking smile appeared on the man's expressionless face. He coldly glanced at her. It's a disease to think too highly of yourself. Jinwan, you're seriously ill. Probably. He is seriously ill, Wang Yao said. Jinwan leaned back on the sofa and looked at him. You're so cold and heartless to me, but I feel that you love me very much. The man's face could no longer be described as expressionless. Instead, there was a deeper coldness and determination. The air fell into a strange silence. The man didn't speak, and neither did Jinwan. There was a gust of wind blowing outside the window. As the wind blew past the window, the sound of the wind could be heard, blowing away this unusual silence. It's 1 a.m. He didn't look at her. He said softly and indifferently, turn off the lights and go back to the bedroom to sleep. If she listened carefully, she could hear the coldness of ice shards falling to the ground from his words that sounded like he was concerned about her. This man was really, Jinwan couldn't help but wonder if he would be overjoyed when he heard the news when she was framed and thrown into prison after 10 years of wandering, instead of suddenly appearing in prison the moment she vomited blood and died. As she had once dreamed, perhaps a dream was really just a dream. His attitude seemed to be that he hated her to the bone. He hadn't appeared for 10 years. How could he have any extra thoughts about her life and death? He was just someone unrelated to her. Just like right now, she seemed to be someone unrelated to him. When will you sleep? Jinwan leaned against the sofa and didn't move. Mo Jingshan said indifferently without raising his eyes. I'll rest when I want to sleep. You don't need to worry about this. But I want you to sleep with me in your arms. Jinwan looked at his face and said sincerely, like before. Mo Jingshan frowned and turned to look at her coldly. Now you even take the initiative to humiliate yourself? Jinwan looked at his face under the dim light of the floor lamp and said frankly and sincerely, you always like to sleep with me in your arms. The man's smile was cold. He indifferently curved his lips, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. That's the Mo Jingshan from 10 months ago, not me. Jinwan abruptly got up and walked toward him. The dark night always gave people inexplicably courage. She wanted to hug him, or let him hug her. Since he woke up, he didn't even want to touch her hand, let alone be hugged. Maybe if she hugged him, he would be moved. If she hugged him, he would come back, and he wouldn't be like this again. However, before she approached, Mo Jingshan didn't speak. As if he had seen through her purpose, he turned away when her hand was about to touch him, and entered the study without looking back. The light from the only floor lamp in the living room lengthened her shadow, and cast a long shadow on the ground. Jinwan looked at the door of the study that was closed again, and stood there for a while. Then she felt a gradual pain in her stomach. Mo Jingshan did know her well. She was a person who could endure any disaster and survive. However, a small cold, a small fever, or even a period could make her suffer just because she ate something cold. The bowl of noodles just now was cold and sticky. She really shouldn't have eaten it. She raised her hand to cover her stomach. After standing for a while, she couldn't stand it anymore. She turned back to the sofa and sat down. She curled up on the sofa and covered her increasingly painful stomach with her hand. The door of the study was closed, and there was no sound. The living room was also so quiet that it felt a little lonely. Jinwon endured the pain in her stomach and raised her eyes. The tears that were forced back into her eyes blurred her vision. Looking at the light of the floor lamp, she curled up on the sofa uncomfortably. It hurt, but she asked for it. When she ate those noodles just now, she didn't know if she was a little irrational and masochistic. Would his heart ache? The truth was, he didn't intend to care about her. He personally spoiled her into such a delicate little princess. But in the end, he cruelly pushed her back into the cold cage and ignored her. Chapter 377. As time went by, Jinwon's tightly curled body on the sofa gradually relaxed, but her hand was still covering her stomach. Unknowingly, she fell asleep in the torment in waiting. She slept very soundly, but she also had a series of dreams. When Jinwon turned over and felt the weight of the quilt on her body, she opened her eyes, looked down at the quilt, and found that she was lying on the bed in the bedroom. Didn't she lie on the sofa last night because of a stomachache? Didn't she fall asleep on the sofa just like that? How did she end up in the bed? Jinwon sat up, looked down, and saw that she was still wearing the same clothes as last night. Did Emo Jingshin carry her in? As soon as this idea came to her mind, Jinwon's heart leaped with joy. She lifted the quilt, got up, and hurried out of the bedroom. However, as soon as she walked out, she saw a strange ant cleaning the room of Aolan International. When she turned to see Jinwon with sleepy eyes, she smiled politely at her. "You're awake." Jinwon was no longer surprised that someone would come in to clean here. She smiled politely at the ant, looked in the direction of the study and asked, "Is Mr. Emo still here?" Mr. Emo left after 6 o'clock. The ant wiped the coffee table with a clean rag and said, "I came at 6 o'clock and saw you sleeping on the sofa, without even covering yourself with the quilt. So I helped you into the bedroom to sleep. Mr. Emo left very early. He should be in the company now." The little flame that had just risen in Jinwon's heart was instantly extinguished, as if a basin of cold water had been poured over it. "You helped me into the bedroom?" Jinwon fixed her eyes on the ant. The ant was still wiping the coffee table and the surrounding table pillars. She didn't look at Jinwon and said seriously while wiping, "Yes, it's still a little cold indoors in spring. I thought you might catch a cold if you slept like this, so I helped you in." Jinwon didn't speak anymore, turned to the study, opened the door and walked in. She saw that the computer, books, and other things in the study had been tidied up by the ant, and there was no trace of Mo Jingshin's work last night. It seemed that she was the only one here last night, and no one else had existed. The ant cleaned up the room so quickly that the room was filled with the light and elegant fragrance of freshener and wash things. But there was no smell of Emo Jingshin. "Would you like breakfast? I've made toast and milk in the kitchen. If you don't like it, I can make some porridge or noodles." The auntie turned to wash her hands, and then came out to ask Jinwon. "I'm not hungry," Jinwon said indifferently, and was about to return to the bedroom. "But you have to eat breakfast. You don't look well. Are you feeling unwell?" "No, maybe it's because I didn't sleep well." Jinwon didn't want to say more. She went back to the bedroom and closed the door. Then in an instant, her legs seemed to lose strength, and she leaned against the door without moving. Emo Jingshin couldn't even be bothered to look at her. When he returned to the study, he was so cold and decisive. How could he possibly care if she had a stomachache on the sofa in the living room? Was he really thinking too highly of himself? Jinwon closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked out of the window. From this angle, she could see where the Emo Corporation building was. The building was dozens of floors high and had a fully tempered modern exterior. It was particularly eye-catching among the many high-rise buildings around it. Her eyes were fixed on the top floor of the building. The glass on all sides reflected the golden rays of the sun, but it was so cold that she couldn't see the staff coming and going inside, and the man in a certain top-floor office. Not long after, the auntie came to knock on the door. Jinwon opened the door, and the auntie handed her a glass of hot milk. "Have a glass of hot milk. It's better for your stomach to drink it hot." "Thank you, I don't." Jinwon suddenly paused and looked up at the kind auntie. "How do you know I have a stomachache?" The auntie paused and then smiled at her kindly and gently. When you fell asleep on the sofa, your hand was pressed against your stomach, so I thought you might have a stomachache or stomach discomfort. Is that so? Jinwon asked. The auntie smiled again. You'd better drink the milk while it's hot. Seeing that the auntie didn't intend to answer, Jinwon took the glass, touched the edge of the moderately warm glass, and then looked at the thin auntie. The auntie looked thinner than her. How could she possibly support her? Jinwon clearly remembered that she had been sleeping soundly. If she had been supported back to the bedroom, she would have felt something. But she didn't feel anything at that time. Besides, the auntie was so thin. Even if she had been supported, she couldn't have been so steady. If she had been carried, the auntie would never have been able to carry her. Besides, she was usually very alert when she slept. Unless the person holding her was Mo Jingshin, she would habitually feel safe and wouldn't suddenly wake up. The apartment in Aolan International was so large that the distance from the sofa in the living room to the bedroom was not close. During the period when she was taken into the bedroom, if the auntie had supported her, how could she not have felt anything? Jinwon put the glass to her mouth, slowly took a sip, and then looked at the auntie again. Seeing that the auntie didn't look at her for too long, she smiled and turned back to do her work. Jinwon stood by the door, drank the milk, looked at the sofa, and then looked back at the bed in the bedroom. The period after returning to High City was the busiest. Not only was Mo Jingshin busy, but Jinwon was also very busy. With the steady and gradual rise of the domestic real estate industry in the past 6 months, her studio had become the hottest cooperation target of many real estate companies. For a long time, Jinwon had to travel all over the country to acquire potential land in other cities, or to expand the studio's other business projects, including some projects related to the tourism industry. The income was indeed considerable, and Jinwon's figure appeared in the domestic financial news again and again. For 2 whole months, she didn't stay in High City much. When she came back to rest for a day or two, she had to attend meetings in the studio or receive tenders and managers of certain real estate companies. Occasionally, she would take a few hours to go back to the U Garden or Aolan International, but she didn't see Mo Jingshin. Chapter 378. Jinwon knew that this was an achievement that Mo Jingshin could have achieved 10 years ago. But for Mo Jingshin 10 years later, everything was within his reach. Jinwon's studio was also becoming more and more mature. She gradually had to deal with some more high-end partners, and occasionally had to fly to Hong Kong, Japan, and other places. She was very busy, and in the next month, Jinwon lingered in the company of her partner in the United States for a contract worth $300 million. This time, only she and Xiaotian were in the United States. Every day, they were busy with work and meeting the superiors and leaders of the business partners. They could hardly leave the company and the hotel. During this period, when she had time, she would call the U Garden and ask if Mo Jingshin had gone back to live recently. The answer was no. The password of Aolan International was still her birthday and hadn't been changed. Every time she went back, Mo Jingshin didn't go back to live. When she was very busy, Jinwon would only send a text message to Mo Jingshin before going to bed, telling him what contracts she had signed today or what problems she had faced today. Mo Jingshin's text messages were changed to no longer have a receipt system, which meant that whether he saw them or not, Jinwon would no longer be marked as read or unread. So Jinwon didn't know whether he saw what she occasionally wanted to say to him or not. But he didn't reply to any of her text messages. As for calling Mo Jingshin, she had indeed called him. In the first busy month, when she finally found time to rest, she called him to talk to him. The first few times the call went through, but the man was still cold and distant. No matter what she said, he would just say a few words and hang up the phone. Or he would directly ask her on the phone, when she would come back to sign the divorce agreement, and tell her not to waste any more time with him. Every time she called him, she was half frozen to death and then died. Jinwon didn't want to hear him mention the divorce again, so she simply stopped calling him and changed to text messages. But he really didn't reply. It was really terrible for a man who was deeply in love to suddenly be heartless. Such a busy work lasted for more than 3 months. High City's spring had long passed and summer had come. Not long ago, Shine in the United States held several shareholder meetings and released a piece of news that Shine Group would begin to expand into the internet field in China and set up an internet company in High City. It would be temporarily incorporated into the merged Shine Mo Corporation and would be fully managed by Mo Jingshan. Shine in the United States would send a project leader to assist in the management of the new company. Mo Jingshan became busier. Even when Jinwan finally returned to a stable pace of life and was no longer so busy, she could hardly see him. He was either in the company or on a business trip. He was traveling around the world, but he was not in her sight. It was as if he was very far away from her world. Jinwan had taken some time to chat with Shenmu. Shenmu said that CEO Mo was really busier than ever. In fact, there were many times when he could find time to rest, but he was like a cold machine, indifferent to everything and almost treating the company as his home. Sometimes, he was so busy that he didn't even have time to eat. Often, when everyone got off work and went to rest, he was still busy with meetings with other foreign partners. When everyone went to work in the morning, they would often find that CEO Mo hadn't slept all night. No one knew why CEO Mo was forcing himself to be so busy now. Shenmu couldn't understand it either. But the company was indeed developing at a terrible speed. Jinwan really couldn't find Mo Jingshan. This feeling was as if she was in China, and he was also in China. It was not like the past when he went to the United States and ignored her for 10 years. But now, the pace of their lives seemed to have returned to that life that had nothing to do with each other. She didn't agree to divorce him, nor did she sign the divorce agreement. He was her husband, but she couldn't even see him. Jinwan knew that he was too busy these days, so she didn't bother him. No matter how busy he was, he couldn't be busy for a lifetime. She had the patience to wait for him. Emonwan's studio. A stack of documents was placed on the desk. Jinwan glanced at the contents on the page, then lowered her head to read other documents without saying a word. Why are you so gloomy recently? Xia Tian, who was at the desk, pushed the documents aside, leaned against the desk, lowered her head to approach her, and asked her, "Really? Maybe I'm too tired. Why don't you try going on business trips for several months?" Jinwan turned another page and said indifferently, "I just came back to rest for a few days. I guess I haven't adjusted my state of mind yet." "I think you've been short of a man's nourishment for too long," Xia Tian sneered. "I find that since you came back from the United States with Mo Jingshan, you two seem to have little contact. He's busy and you're busy. But why hasn't he come to pick you up recently when you rarely have a break? I heard from Xiaoba that Mo Jingshan used to pick you up often. You said he's busy and I'm busy. How can he have time to pick me up?" Jinwan didn't even lift her eyelids. "Is that so?" Xia Tian raised her eyebrows and said, "Don't keep it to yourself. Is there something wrong with your relationship?" Jinwan, who had just picked up the pen to sign at the bottom of the document, suddenly paused, and the last tick of her name was suddenly lengthened. She stared at her messed up name and paused for a long time. Then she silently put down the pen, threw the document back on the desk, and looked up at Xia Tian. "Do you want to have a drink with me when you have time?" Xia Tian's eyelids twitched, and she waved her hand with a look of disgust. "Forget about drinking. With your alcohol tolerance, drinking with you is like sending you into a pit of fire. I won't cause this kind of trouble. If you want to drink, I will definitely not accompany you." Jinwan, "I've been a good drinker recently, and I've drunk a little in the last few social engagements. Although it's not much, it's much better than before." "Didn't Xiaoba secretly change your wine to fruit wine every time you went to a social engagement? You should thank the heavens that you have such a considerate little assistant who's afraid that you'll be taken advantage of. Right now, many of the business partners in our studio have been drooling over you for a long time. If they didn't know you were Mo Jingshan's wife, their claws would have long been on you. It's just that these people don't dare to offend the Mo family. Do you really think the wine you usually drink at social engagements is low in alcohol content? It's all because Xiaoba changed it for you to protect you. Dash. Chapter 379. How come I don't see anyone coveting me? Jinwon raised her eyebrows. When I went to dinner with you several times, I saw someone asking for your phone number. Pa, isn't it because they know you have Mo Jingshan backing you up? Even if they wanted to poach you, they wouldn't dare to. Thus, they settled for the next best thing, hoping to develop some ambiguous relationship with me. TSK, these people don't even think about it. Am I that kind of person? Jinwon squinted at her. Aren't you that kind of person? Last time, who was the one who drank too much and was carried to a hotel by a male classmate during a gathering with her old classmates. Then she was discovered by her criminal police boyfriend. The two of them quarreled until now and haven't reconciled yet, right? Xiatian. Nothing to say? Do you think everyone doesn't know your way of life? Although your temperament is simple and straightforward, and you're very loyal to your relationship, you give others the feeling that you're particularly unreliable and casual when it comes to relationships. You're also stubborn and don't like to explain. If there's a misunderstanding, you just hold it in. You're crazy. Tell me, how many people can stand you? I can't stand that stone anymore. He is smelly and hard. No wonder he came from a rich family to become a criminal police officer. He should have been an old cadre in the 1980s. Why does he have to control me all the time? Let's have a cold war. At worst, we can just break up. I don't want to serve you anymore. Jinwon, haha. Why are you sneering? Xiatian glared at her. What are you laughing at? Last time, who was the one who took the initiative to break up with him, causing him to agree in a fit of anger? Then he called me and cried for half the night. Until he calmed down, I didn't dare to go to the police station to find him. In the end, after they finally reconciled, I carefully held on to him all day long. The only thing missing was calling him uncle every day. Who is that? Now you want to break up with him? How on earth can he stand you with such a bad temper? Xiatian picked up the documents on the table and threw them hard on the table. Jinwon, let's break up. Oh, take care. I won't see you out. Xiatian snorted but didn't leave. She leaned on her desk, cupped her face in her hands, and put on a cute expression. Honey, I don't want to drink. If you are in a bad mood, I'll go shopping with you, okay? The corner of Jinwon's lips twitched. Just use your winking skills on your boyfriend. Can you not harm me like this? If you have the time to act cute, you might as well have a good chat with him. Xiatian refused to have a heart-to-heart talk with a certain someone. The smile on her face disappeared, and she looked at Jinwon seriously. Are you going to accompany me shopping or not? What do you want to buy? Jinwon furrowed her brows and pushed her arm. Move aside. You're pressing against my documents. Xiatian crossed her legs and swung them in the air. It's been too hot recently. My shoes are not comfortable to wear. I'm going to change into a new pair of shoes. As she spoke, she lowered her head to glance at Jinwon's feet. The shoes you're wearing today are rubbing against your feet. Don't you know that? The skin on your ankles has turned red. Don't you feel any pain? Hearing this, Jinwon lowered her head to take a look. When she came to the studio in the morning, she drove and didn't walk much. Later, when she had a meeting, she walked back and forth in the corridor of the studio for a while, and did feel a little pain. However, Xiaoba had something to talk to her about, and they went to the meeting room while talking, so Jinwon didn't take it too seriously. Later, when she returned to the office, she had been sitting here, and the pain had lessened a lot. Reminded by Xiatian, Jinwon moved her feet. It does hurt a little. Xiatian patted her desk. Then let's go shopping and buy shoes together. After the meeting with the partners at 1 p.m., we can get off work early at 3 p.m. Let's go downtown together? What do you think? Jinwon didn't speak. She had planned to call Mo Jingshan tonight, because she had asked Shinmu in the morning. Shinmu said that CEO Mo would be in the company today, and had no meetings or social engagements in the evening. But seeing Xiatian's eager expression, Jinwon couldn't bear it. All right. I haven't been shopping in a long time. Two women in a bad mood, apart from drinking to drown their sorrows, can only go shopping. You don't even plan to go shopping with me? Jinwon held her forehead. It's you who wants to break up, not me. Who said I'm in a bad mood? You wear a resentful face every day. Don't you feel it? Emo Jingshan has been so busy recently that he probably doesn't have time to talk to you. In the past, you were as happy as a peach every day. You almost let others know that you and your husband are having a good time every night. But now you're obviously in the cold palace. Do you dare to say that you're in a good mood? Why did there have to be such a creature in this world that could see through your thoughts at a glance? It really didn't feel good to be seen through at a glance. When they left the studio, it was already 3:30 p.m. Many large shopping malls didn't close until 10 p.m., but some more unique malls closed at 4:30 p.m. After leaving the studio, the two women raced all the way to the commercial street in the center of High City. Xia Tian had been thinking of coming here to eat Japanese food. The two of them didn't eat much in the studio at noon, but now they were in a hurry to go to the mall, so they could only go to the mall with an empty stomach and come out to eat after buying shoes. Jinwan didn't go shopping as she used to. If she wanted to buy shoes, she would go directly to the shoe store and finish the task quickly. Xia Tian said very unhappily that she came here today only to complete the task of buying shoes and had no intention of shopping at all. Aren't you just here to buy shoes? If you want to buy something else, just go buy it. My ankles have been worn out. How far can I go? Jinwan sat on a long leather chair in the middle of a high-end shoe store, watching Xia Tian, who was going back and forth by the shoe cabinet, and said absent-mindedly as she browsed the news on her cell phone. Xia Tian turned back and rolled her eyes at her. Then hurry up and choose a pair of shoes. When your ankles get blisters, you'll know how painful it is. Jinwan looked up at the shoes in this store. She and Xia Tian liked a lot of the same things, such as the style, color, brand, and so on. Just as Jinwan glanced at a pair of shoes placed in the glass window of this store, she suddenly saw two figures passing by outside the glass window. It was a man and a woman. Chapter 380. At the moment when Jinwan's eyes suddenly froze outside the glass window, Xia Tian happened to turn around while trying on her new shoes and caught a glimpse of the people passing by outside. Xia Tian's eyelids trembled and she said abruptly, "What the hell? Why would CEO Mo and that and what's her name again? And Xuyan, why are they here?" The next moment, Xia Tian suddenly paused and turned to look at Jinwan with a jerk. Some time ago, she did hear a piece of news. Shine Group, the new internet company established in China, had sent in Xuyan to High City. However, Jinwan just sat there silently, put on the shoes that hurt her feet, and stood up as if she couldn't feel the pain. She walked to the door and watched the couple walk to the other side. Perhaps it was a woman's sixth sense, or perhaps Xuyan had already seen Jinwan sitting here. But when Jinwan walked to the door and looked out, Xuyan turned her head to Emo Jingshan and whispered something with a smile. Emo Jingshan's back was still facing this direction, so she couldn't see his expression. At this time, Xia Tian put on her shoes and rushed out. Jinwan subconsciously raised her hand to hold her, asking in a low voice, "What are you doing? I'm going to beat the mistress." Xia Tian glared at her and looked like she was about to explode. What the hell does Emo Jingshan mean? Doesn't he love you so much that it almost penetrates into his bones? Now he's going shopping with a woman who's always harboring evil intentions towards him? Is he falling in love with someone else, or trying to put a green hat on your head? Look at that in Xuyan. She's smiling so happily. Damn it. Let go of me and let me go. Jinwan put all her strength into her hand and held Xia Tian's hand tightly. Don't go. Why are you so scared? Now your husband is shopping with another woman. Jinwan, how can you tolerate this? Xia Tian glared at her angrily. Of course not. She was not scared. She didn't believe that Emo Jingshan didn't see her. This man had always been very perceptive. Even though she had been sitting in the window, there was no one else in the shoe store. When they walked over, they would have seen Xia Tian standing by the shoe cabinet and her. Emo Jingshan didn't believe that Emo Jingshan had not seen her. That's right, Emo Jingshan used to love her to the bone. But now he really froze her entire body, flesh, and even her bones. Inch by inch, he cruelly extracted her like ice shards. Jinwan, they've already left. I know. You really don't plan to go? Why would I go there? When she turned back, She saw that Shuyan and Mo Jingshan were in a beverage area dozens of meters away from the mall. And Shuyan was buying coffee, and the man's tall and straight figure was still there. Damn it! Xia Tian struggled to break free again. She wanted nothing more than to slap Shuyan across the face and send her to the 18th level of hell. Jinwan, however, dragged her away. Why are you leaving? Xia Tian looked at him with disappointment. Jinwan, you're not usually so timid. Bring out the temper you had when you were screwing those rich ladies. If you dare to be a steamed bun, I will be the first to not forgive you. This kind of thing definitely cannot be tolerated. Jinwan didn't say a word, but pulled her hard in another direction. Xia Tian didn't expect her to be so strong. She stomped her feet angrily and was dragged more than 10 meters away. When she followed Jinwan to the elevator, Xia Tian looked back again. Seeing that they were still there, she angrily rolled her eyes. After entering the elevator and reaching the first floor, Jinwan let go of her and walked out quickly without looking back. Xia Tian wanted to call her back. The mistress was so arrogant. She couldn't let her go like this. But before she spoke, she suddenly paused, looked at Jinwan's feet with a jerk, and hurried to catch up with her. Don't your feet hurt? Don't go. Just now, they were almost blistered. If you walk like this, you will die of pain. It doesn't hurt, Jinwan said indifferently, and then continued to walk out without stopping, as if there was something terrible chasing her and biting her in the largest department store in High City. She couldn't wait to get as far away from it as possible. Jinwan didn't say anything. It would be strange if it didn't hurt. Xia Tian saw that the skin on her ankle, which had been rubbed red before, was now broken. Perhaps this kind of pain couldn't compare to the pain in her heart. Oh, you can't wear these shoes anymore. Let's not go shopping. Let's buy a pair of comfortable shoes on the roadside and put them on. Xia Tian caught up with her and said in a much softer tone. She knew Jinwan too well. People like Jinwan could be two extremes. When she was very stubborn, no one could bully her. But if she chose to retreat now, it meant that she couldn't hold up the mentality to fight, and that she was more vulnerable than others thought. Jinwan didn't go back to the studio. After leaving the mall, she drove Xia Tian back to her place, and then drove back to the U Garden. It happened to be the weekend tomorrow, and the next 2 days. Jinwan felt that she might need to rest for 2 days. She shut herself in the bedroom of the U Garden, and didn't go out for 2 days. Auntie Chen came to ask her to eat, but she didn't go downstairs. Auntie Chen had to bring up the cooked food for her, only to find that Jinwan had only taken a few mouthfuls of the porridge for breakfast and barely touched lunch and dinner. The U Garden was really too big, and the bedroom was empty and too quiet. After passing by him in the mall, Jinwan didn't send any messages to Mo Jingshan, nor did she call him or Shenmu. In the past 2 days, Xia Tian came to accompany her once. Auntie Chen was afraid that she was uncomfortable because she had no appetite. So she went upstairs again and again to ask about her physical condition. Mo Jingshan didn't come back. It was as if he had completely walked out of her world. In the past 2 days, Jinwan clearly understood one thing. In terms of who was more heartless and cruel, she was afraid that she really couldn't compare to Mo Jingshan. When he loved her, he could give her the greatest happiness and tenderness in the world. But when he decided not to love her anymore, he would uproot himself from her world, including his flesh and blood. He wouldn't care whether she was in pain or not. He only cared whether he left quickly or not. Could he really be so heartless to her so completely? Staying at home for 2 days, Jinwan felt a little dizzy. When she got up on Monday morning, she almost couldn't get up. She rubbed her hair and forced herself to sit up. On the weekends, she could indulge herself and not eat if she didn't want to. But today she had to go to work and needed strength. So when Auntie Chen called her for breakfast, this time, Jinwan obediently went downstairs to eat. Although she didn't eat much, she tried hard to eat some. She wasn't the kind of person who couldn't live with her body when she encountered a little blow. Life had to go on, and so did work. There was no turning back in life. In her previous life, she fell again and again because she was too confused and too weak. Chapter 381. Boss, you are in a bad state of mind. Did you go out and stay up late to have fun during the weekend? You look more haggard on vacation than when you are on vacation, Xiaoba said as she followed Jinwan out of the conference room. Yes, I didn't sleep well, Jinwan answered flatly. You can't stay like this. Next month, our studio will officially move to the office building in the city center. Now even the sign of our studio has been hung up. Our company's housewarming party will be held for 3 days in a row. All the partners and clients will probably come. You look like you will fall down at any time. You have to sleep well and eat well during the vacation. Otherwise, I'm afraid you won't be able to stand it for a day. Okay. Seeing that Jinwan didn't seem to want to talk, Xiaoba didn't follow her and went back to the office. At this time, Xia Tian happened to come over. She took a look at Xiaoba and then at Jinwan and asked Xiaoba to go back to the assistant's office with a stern face. When Xiaoba left, Xia Tian looked at Jinwan, who obviously didn't eat or sleep well. I thought you would feel better if I let you rest at home for a few days, but look at you now. I might as well rush up and give Shuyan a slap. It's better than being so wrong now. Okay, that's enough. Jinwan put a stack of documents in her hand. Go to Jiang City with me these 2 days. There is a problem with a piece of land in the tourist area. At that time, the document issued to me by Jiang City was missing a stamp. Now the higher-ups are using this reason to refuse to give us the ownership of the land, but the money has been paid. Xiaoba and the others can't handle this kind of behavior. We'll go in person. Recently, as long as Jinwan talked about work, she was like a clockwork machine. She didn't care about anything except work. Xia Tian didn't know what was wrong with her before. Now she finally knew. Are you sure you want to go to Jiang City at this time? Are you going to give your man to others? Xia Tian asked with an ugly face. Jinwan, who had just pushed the door into the office, stiffened and said indifferently, Shuyan has been in High City for more than a month, and I didn't know it until 2 days ago. If something really happened, it would have happened long ago. What can I do in High City? I can't see her in High City. It makes no difference. With that, Jinwan went straight in. Xia Tian was extremely angry, but seeing Jinwan's sudden coldness, she did not know how much she had endured in her heart. Although they were good sisters, if Jinwan refused to do anything, she couldn't do anything. She had to get her friend's permission to do anything for her friend. Otherwise, even if she went to Mo Jingshan with a knife, it would only bring her the opposite effect. Xia Tian followed him into the office. Then let's go to Jiang City for 2 days. The temperature there is higher than in High City. Should we prepare 2 swimsuits and go to the newly developed seascape tourist area in Jiang City for a night? Not interested. Jinwan sat down behind her desk and lowered her head to look at the documents. Her reply was cold and indifferent. Xia Tian choked. The biggest difference between her and Jinwan was that when Xia Tian was in a bad mood or had emotional problems, she would find a way to vent her anger and get happier and happier. But Jinwan, on the other hand, began to restrain herself. She was no longer as arrogant and domineering as she used to be. She had forced herself to be too calm and rational. Now in Xia Tian's view, it was really uncomfortable to hold back. In the afternoon, Jinwan was still reading the documents when suddenly there was a knock on the office door, and Xiaoba came in with a large bouquet of roses. Jinwan looked up at the roses and glanced at her strangely. What's this? Xiaoba coughed and then said in a low voice. These are flowers from Mr. Vince, the general manager of BGY Group. In fact, he has been sending you flowers for almost 2 months. He sends you such a large bouquet of red roses every day. Seeing Jinwan frowning coldly and not speaking, Xiaoba said, But Sister Xia Tian, and I stopped these flowers. Sister Xia Tian has stopped so many pursuers for you. She usually doesn't let me tell you about this kind of thing. She just tells you to work in the studio and leave the other things to her. But today the flowers were delivered on time. I was going to throw them away out of habit, but Sister Xia Tian said that if anyone sends you flowers in the future, she won't stop them and ask me to bring them to you. Looking at the bouquet of flowers, Jinwan raised her hand to her forehead and didn't speak for a while. Xia Tian had nowhere to vent her anger, so now she simply wanted to help her develop a second love. This Mr. Vince was an overseas returnee in his 30s, who looked gentle and wore gold-rimmed glasses. It was said that he had a master's degree in management overseas. At a young age, he climbed to the position of general manager of BGY Group. He was very resourceful and intelligent, but he was too shrewd and cunning. Jinwon didn't like to deal with this kind of person, so when this man asked her to have dinner with him, she just thought he wanted to be polite to her because of their business relationship, but she politely refused him. She didn't expect that there was such a thing. No wonder every time she went to drive after work, she would find bouquets piled up in the nearby trash can. It turned out that they were all thrown out by Xia Tian and Xiaoba. "Boss, I'll help you find a vase and put the flowers in it," Xiaoba said and rushed to find it. "No, throw it away as usual," Jinwon said lightly. "By the way, call Mr. Vince back and tell him not to send me flowers in the future. It's not like he doesn't know that I'm married. What's the point of flirting with me with flowers? This may be the etiquette he's used to after he came back from studying abroad. There's nothing wrong with liking you. Besides, he just sent you flowers in a gentlemanly manner and didn't do anything else. He has insisted on sending you flowers for so long. Every day when I throw them away, my heart aches," Xiaoba muttered. Jinwon glanced at her. "So do you think a married woman like me should happily accept the flowers that other men send me every day? And even happily put the words he sent me in your office?" Chapter 382. After arriving in Jiang City, because of the stamping problem, they were deliberately delayed by several scoundrels from the business and political circles, which caused the project of the tourist area land to be temporarily put on hold. Jinwon and Xia Tian ran around, using their connections everywhere, and it took them 2 days to finally get the missing stamp back. Of course, they hardly rested these 2 days. Even Xia Tian had dark circles under her eyes for 2 consecutive nights, not to mention Jinwon. On the way back, the 2 women closed their eyes to rest, too tired to say a word. "You're really going too far. Do you think we're just a small studio with no trump cards? You want to annex a deal worth more than 100 million yuan because of the lack of a stamp? Do you think I'm such a good-tempered person? How dare you offend us without looking at our trump cards?" Xia Tian opened her eyes and said angrily after a short nap in the car. "In any case, we've come to an agreement. We didn't lose anything. We just wasted a lot of time talking. We got the order back, and the land is officially under the name of our studio. We're lucky to have this kind of result when we go head-on against people from both the business and the political circles." Jinwon said calmly, "We should learn a lesson in the future. This kind of document can't be left without a stamp, lest others take advantage of it again." Xia Tian sat beside her with her eyes closed, whispering, "You're not even afraid of these scoundrels. You dare to fight back, and no one dares to bully you. You can find the best way to solve such a difficult problem. But now your marriage and love have problems. Why can't you find a way to solve it?" Jinwon opened her eyes and turned to look at the scenery outside the car window that was quickly moving backward. If he was still the old Mo Jingshan, there would be no problem with their love and marriage, and he would not allow any misunderstanding, cold war, or quarrel with her. But now Mo Jingshan, he was still him, but it seemed that he was no longer him. Jinwon really didn't know how to face such a Mo Jingshan. When she first returned to China with him, she was full of enthusiasm, thinking that no matter what, he was the man she loved, and that no matter how high the iceberg was, it would melt one day. But he didn't even see her face, and didn't even give her the chance to live under the same roof. He was busy in the company, and the company was not a place for love. After the merger of Mo Corporation and Shine, the management was stricter than before. She could not go to his company to pester him. Besides, even if she went to the company, he might not be there. Just like a few days ago, when she went to look for him, Shenmu said that President Mo was not around. It seemed that her courage had been gradually cooled and scattered. It seemed that Mo Jingshan really knew her, and knew how to deal with her. When she said that she would never divorce, and insisted on being with him, he didn't say anything but left her life in such a way that he didn't exist in her world. so her passion and her insistence were nothing but air. He was a man who had dominated Shine and the ruthless American business world for many years. His methods and ruthlessness were not something Jin-won could match. It took about 3 hours to drive from Jeong City to Hai City. During these 3 hours, Jin-won slept and woke up. When she returned to Hai City, it was already evening. But she didn't expect it to rain today. Jin-won didn't bring an umbrella, so she went downstairs to get the car. On the way back to the Yew Garden, she passed a manhole cover that had just been overturned. The manhole cover had not been surrounded by a protective fence. The rain was too heavy for Jin-won to see clearly, so she drove the car directly to the manhole cover, and the wheels were stuck inside. She had to get out of the car in the rain, check it, and then return to the car to make a phone call. When the person in charge of the traffic team came to help her move the car out, it was already an hour later. Jin-won had just driven back to the Yew Garden. Auntie Chun was startled to see her. "Didn't you drive back? Why are you wet? Come on, take a hot shower, and then come out to eat some food and drink some hot water. Don't catch a cold." Jin-won responded. As soon as she went upstairs to the bedroom, she felt dizzy and almost lost her balance. She leaned against the door for a long time, raised her hand to rub her temples, and then walked in. But she really didn't have the energy to take a shower, and her clothes were wet, so she couldn't go to bed. She simply sat on the ground like this for a while, but she felt too tired. Perhaps she had been working hard for a long time and didn't eat or sleep well. 2 days ago, when she was harassed by those rascals in Jeong City, she had been suppressing her anger. At this moment, she felt that her whole body was not well. Her ears were buzzing, as if her physical strength had reached its limit. She could finally relax, and sleepiness swept over her. After returning to the bedroom for nearly an hour, Jin-won still didn't have the strength to go to the bathroom. In the end, she simply lay on the cold ground and looked at the crystal lamp on the ceiling. She didn't even know when she fell asleep. When the bedroom door was knocked, Jin-won turned over on the ground and felt that the floor was too hard. She frowned and opened her eyes in a daze, only to hear Auntie Chun calling her outside the door. "Madam, have you taken a shower? Come and eat. I made you brown sugar ginger tea. Come out and drink it. Don't catch a cold. Your body is afraid of catching a cold. In the past, every time you caught a cold, you would have a high fever. I still remember it." Jin-won struggled on the ground to sit up, raised her hand, and touched her messy hair, which was still damp and smelled of rain. Hearing that Auntie Chun was still knocking on the door, she had to get up, but she staggered on the spot, barely steadied herself, walked over, and opened the door. Auntie Chun saw her unusual face. "Oh, why do you look so pale? Haven't you taken a shower?" "No, I'll go down to eat first, and then come up to take a shower," Jin-won said and went straight out. Seeing that she was still wearing wet clothes, Auntie Chun was about to say something, but then she remembered that Mr. Mo hadn't returned to the Yew Garden for months after Jin-won came back, and Jin-won had been particularly quiet during this period. Auntie Chun didn't say anything, but hurriedly followed Jin-won downstairs, thinking that they must turn off the air conditioner in the hall, in case it was too cold. Jin-won walked down quietly. When she was still 5 or 6 steps away from the tiled floor of the hall, she felt more and more dizzy, and suddenly everything went black. She subconsciously tried to hold the handrail, but before her hand touched the handrail, she fell down, hit her head on the stairs, and sank into darkness. Chapter 383. Seeing Jin-won's condition, the servants were startled. Someone rushed over and helped Auntie Chun to help Jin-won up, and someone hurriedly turned to make a phone call. In a flurry, as soon as the phone was connected, Jin-won woke up. Leaning against Auntie Chun's arms, she frowned and rubbed her aching forehead. At the same time, she heard the servant say to the phone, "Mr. Mo, Madam fainted and fell on the stairs. When can you come back, Mr. Mo?" Hearing this, Jin-won immediately turned her eyes. "Don't call him back. I'm fine." Her voice was very light, but the servant paused because of her words. Then she hesitated and came over with the phone. "Madam, Mr. Mo asked me to give you the phone." Jin-won was silent, took the phone and put it to her ear. The man's voice on the other side of the phone was casual and indifferent, but it was as cold as ever. Hearing it, she shuddered. What? Can't you even do the most basic healthy lifestyle? In addition to catching a cold and having a fever, you even want to cripple yourself just by walking? Jinwon didn't expect him to come back. Besides, she just fainted and lost her footing. However, hearing this, she still felt cold. I didn't force you to come back. Just now, the servant was too concerned about me, so she made a fuss. Don't mind it. But the Yew Garden is our home. Are you going to never come back? Mo Jingshan's tone was calm, making it impossible to guess his mood. I can see that you like that place very much. The ownership of the Yew Garden property has been transferred to your name. Just this property alone is enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You won't follow the same footsteps and live a homeless life again. Of course, she wouldn't live like that again. She had her own job, and a life she worked hard to support. Right now, Jinwon really didn't have the energy to pester him about these things that were not important to her. She tightened her grip on the phone and asked again. Are you really not going to return to the Yew Garden? There was no answer. Mo Jingshan hung up the phone. There was a cold cut-off sound on the phone. Jinwon listened for a long time, as if she couldn't be sure if he really hung up the phone, and as if she couldn't believe that he would suddenly hang up without saying a word to her. Mrs. Mo. Auntie Chen and the servants wanted to help her up, but Jinwon sat on the ground, looking down at the phone screen that had gone dark. I'm fine. I just fell. Jinwon gently pushed Auntie Chen's hands away. I can get up on my own. You can go and do whatever you need to do. Madam, shall I help you to the dining table? Auntie Chen asked softly. Jinwon nodded. It was not until Auntie Chen helped her up that she felt dizzy again. After helping her to the dining table, Auntie Chen suddenly raised her hand and touched her forehead. When I helped you just now, I felt that your body was very hot through your sleeves. Do you have a cold or a fever? Shall I call a doctor? I'm fine. It's just a little rain. It's not that serious. I'll just drink the brown sugar ginger tea you just made. The man stood in the cold office, his long legs stretched out, and he walked unhurriedly to the floor-to-ceiling window. In the rainy night, there was not the slightest bit of light from the moon and stars. Even through the window, he could feel the bone-chilling coldness falling on the pure color of the office that was filled with documents. When Qin Sighting received the call, he had just gotten off work at the hospital. Seeing that it was Mo Jingshan, he picked it up. The man on the other end of the phone spoke in a low voice, clean and clear. Find a doctor with medical ethics and skills similar to yours to go to the Yew Garden to see Jinwon. Qin Sighting's hand, which was about to open the car door, paused. What's wrong with her? Don't I have to go myself? You don't have to go. Send someone she doesn't know. Obviously, he didn't intend to let Jinwon know that he sent the doctor. Qin Sighting frowned, and was about to ask what he meant when the phone was hung up. Jinwon had just finished dinner, and was drinking the brown sugar ginger tea Auntie Chen had made for her. Her pale face looked slightly red from the heat, and she was sweating a little. Then the doctor suddenly came. Who called the doctor? Jinwon asked. I just called Miss Feng Ling. Miss Feng said that she would ask Dr. Qin. It seems that Dr. Qin said that he wouldn't be in High City these days, so he sent a colleague from the hospital over. Auntie Chen told Jinwon everything she had heard on the phone. Jinwon glanced at the doctor, who smiled politely at her, and said that it was Dr. Qin who sent him over. She nodded. Jinwon's illness was not serious. It was just that she hadn't rested well these days and couldn't eat much. Her body was in a state of fatigue, and she had some signs of a cold and fever from the rain. Everything else was fine. She just needed to take cold medicine and antipyretics, rest more, drink more hot water, and eat more to maintain her strength. She understood all of this. Hearing the doctor say that there was no problem, Auntie Chen was relieved. After the doctor left, Auntie Chen urged Jinwon to take a hot bath. Jinwon obediently went to take a bath, and obediently went back to the bedroom to sleep after taking the medicine. But when she turned over on the bed, she looked at the empty other side of the bed, and reached out to touch the bed. It had been a long time since she had Mo Jingshan's scent and warmth here. Sure enough, when he cared about her, even the slightest headache or fever could be hugged and coaxed. It was as if she was a fragile porcelain doll when she was sick. He wanted to hold her in his hands. But now she couldn't get sick at all. In his eyes, if there was even the slightest problem with her body, he would think that she was using some despicable trick to lure him back. Was the image of her in his heart, that she would do anything to achieve her goals, so deeply rooted? She felt so warm and happy when she hugged Imo Jingshan. But after all of this suddenly disappeared, she felt so lonely and lost. She wanted to give up and leave. She asked herself, did she really decide to give up like this? After such a long time, she couldn't be clearer about what kind of man Imo Jingshan was. No matter what he did, there would always be a reason. But what exactly was the reason that made a man who wasn't even afraid of death push her away again and again? Jinwan sniffled. It was already late. Although her head hurt, she didn't feel sleepy. She sat up on the bed and stared at the snow-white wall under the lamp for a long time, but still couldn't fall asleep. There were still a lot of things to do in the studio tomorrow. She had to sleep. She rubbed her head and turned to rummage through the drawer. She found a box of sleeping pills with only 2 or 3 pills. These pills seemed to have been bought by her when Ji Minggran was here. Chapter 384. After a busy day in the studio, Jinwan had dinner with her business partners as usual. Xia Tian had declined the previous few social engagements. Today the heads of BGY and WK came to discuss the land purchase agreement, so Jinwan had to show up. At 8 o'clock in the evening, in the VIP room of the Royal Clubhouse in High City, Xiao Ba and another assistant were singing, and Jinwan was discussing the cooperation with the head of WK. The heads of the two companies wanted her to have a few drinks with them, but seeing Jinwan didn't look too good today, she asked for juice instead of wine, and everyone agreed. Jinwan was the only one in the entire room who didn't drink. Xia Tian came back and winked at Jinwan, telling her to go out and hide. Jinwan really couldn't stand the singing of Xiao Ba and the others, and the heads of the business partners kept leaning toward her, either sitting next to her or conveniently putting their hands on her waist. Seeing Xia Tian's look, she got up and walked out of the room quickly. When she went out, she happened to receive a call from Feng Ling. Mrs. Mo, I'm sorry. My mission here was delayed for more than 3 months, and I'll be leaving for High City in half a month. Is there anything I can bring back for you? You've just finished your mission. Take a break in the United States before coming back. I'm fine here. When I hired you, I was just guarding against those people in the United States, wasn't I? Now that Su Jilan and the Su family have fallen, and Director Mo hasn't done anything to me, my life has returned to normal and peaceful. You don't have to rush back. Mr. Mo signed a 3-year employment contract with me. Now it's not even a year. Of course I have to go back as soon as possible. All right. You insist on coming back when my studio is moving. At that time, you'll probably have to do all the hard work again. You really have a busy life. Feng Ling smiled. I'll bring gifts for Xiao Ba and the others when I go back. What do you want? As long as you come back safely. By the way, you haven't cut your hair recently, have you? Didn't I tell you to keep it longer last time? I cut it. It's inconvenient when it's long. It's also convenient to tie it back. Do you like short hair so much? Isn't there a saying in China that 3,000 strands of worry? It's very comfortable, and my head feels very light. Jinwan raised her eyebrows and looked down at the slightly wavy hair hanging over her chest. After hanging up the phone, she touched her hair, wondering if Feng Ling liked short hair so much. Should she try a short haircut? Just as this thought sprouted in her mind, she turned around and walked out of the restroom. Suddenly, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure entering the men's restroom on the opposite side. She was startled. Not long after, a tall man came out of the bathroom opposite. When he saw Jinwan outside, he was also stunned. Mrs. Mo. Shinmu. As Jinwan asked, she subconsciously glanced at the men's room behind him, and then at the other directions around her. Although she did not ask, she subconsciously felt that wherever Imo Jingshan was in High City, Shinmu would also be there. Vice versa. If Shinmu was here, Imo Jingshan might be nearby. A business partner arranged for us to come to this club tonight. President Mo is still in the private room. Why are you here? Seeing that Jinwan did not smell of alcohol at all, Shinmu thought she came here with her friends, or to see President Mo. Several clients of my studio have also booked private rooms here. Jinwan briefly explained, but because she heard that Mo Jingshan was here, she looked at the other private rooms. The private rooms in this club were all on this floor. Because of the large space and expensive facilities, there were only 3 of them on this floor. She saw that most of the people in the other 2 private rooms were men and asked, "Only you and Mo Jingshan are here? Are there any other acquaintances?" "No, the place is booked by a business partner tonight. It's a company that has cooperated with CEO Mo for many years. They have a good relationship with CEO Mo, and will continue to carry out other international cooperation projects in the future. It's rare for CEO Mo to agree to this kind of meeting. Tonight, only I accompanied CEO Mo here. The others in the private room are all from our partner companies. There aren't many people. Mrs. Mo, would you like to go in and have a few drinks with us?" "I won't go in. How about this? When you're done, give me a call," Jinwan said lightly. Shinmu was a little confused. In the past few months, CEO Mo had been busy in the company, but Shinmu didn't know whether CEO Mo went home or somewhere else after leaving the company, so he didn't know what happened between Jinwan and him. He just instinctively felt that since Jinwan was Mrs. Mo and CEO Mo was here, she could definitely enter the private room if she wanted to. No one could stop her. But since Jinwan said so, Shinmu nodded and said, "Okay, I got it." When Jinwan returned to the private room, the representatives of BGY and WK saw that her complexion was much better than before, and poured her a glass of fruit wine, asking her to drink with them. Jinwan politely declined with a smile, and continued to pick up the contract to discuss. Fortunately, she brought Xiatian and Xiaoba with her, 2 good helpers who could always liven up the atmosphere. Whenever Jinwan refused to drink, Xiatian would immediately come over to help. At 10:30 in the evening, when the private room was almost finished, Jinwan received a call from Shinmu. "Mrs. Mo, we're going back. Do you want to come with us?" Jinwan picked up the call and said goodbye to the representatives of BGY and WK. Then she said a few words to Xiatian and Xiaoba, and left the private room a few minutes earlier. When she walked out of the club, she saw Mo Jingshan's black ghost parked in front of the door. Shenmu was waiting outside the car door, but Mo Jingshan was nowhere to be seen. Jinwan walked over, and Shenmu directly handed her the electronic car key. "Mrs. Mo, you haven't drunk today, have you?" "I haven't. CEO Mo drank a little too much tonight. I was going to drive him back, but just now my girlfriend called and said she had a stomachache and asked me to accompany her to see a doctor. I was going to call the driver to send CEO Mo, but if you haven't drunk, since you live together, you can send CEO Mo back." Jinwan took the car key. "Okay, then go accompany your girlfriend. Leave it to me." With that, she suddenly paused, looked at the car in front of her, and then at the closed car door. "Did he drink a lot?" Chapter 385. Jinwan nodded, and made a reassuring gesture to Shinmu. "I didn't drink and I'm good at driving. I can send him back." "Then how did you get here?" "Your car. My colleagues in the studio are all here, and the car key is with my assistant. They will drive my car back." "It's okay." "That's good. Then I'll go first. Sorry to trouble you." Mrs. Mo Shinmu turned to the roadside, hailed a taxi and hurried away. Jinwan stood by the black ghost, looked at the cold black car door, thought for a while, went to the driver's side, opened the door and sat in. As she entered, she smelled a strong smell of alcohol. She turned her head and looked back, only to see Mo Jingshan sitting in the back with his eyes closed. She didn't know whether he was asleep or too drunk to open his eyes. It wasn't that she had never smelled alcohol on him before, but this was the first time she had smelled it so strongly. Furthermore, she had never seen him drink too much. His self-control was too strong, and he never indulged himself too much. Jinwan looked at his clothes again. He was wearing a black shirt and trousers. She was right. It seemed that since he woke up from his 2-month sleep, he had been wearing this black, which made him look even colder and more unapproachable. While he kept his eyes closed and seemed to not notice that the driver had been replaced, Jinwan started the engine and was about to drive away. Suddenly, the man's low voice rang. Shenmu. Jinwan didn't speak, nor did she turn her head to look back. She just looked up at the rearview mirror and saw that the man's eyes were closed. He seemed to have a headache from drinking too much and was frowning. Give me water. His voice was hoarse and cold, and he still didn't open his eyes. Jinwan lowered her eyes to look for water in the car, until she saw an unopened bottle of mineral water on the door of the passenger seat. She picked it up and handed it to him. Mo Jingshan opened his eyes slightly. The lights in the car were not turned on, and the light from the surroundings fell into the darkness. The moment he raised his hand to receive the water, he glanced at the fair, slender fingers holding the bottle. His gaze paused for a moment before he silently received the water. He twisted the cap open and took a sip. He then closed his eyes again and leaned back against the seat, not speaking again. Feeling that he didn't seem to notice anything strange, she retracted her hand on the steering wheel, restarted the engine, and drove the black ghost away from the parking space in front of the club. She drove steadily. After all, she was no longer a newbie. The man sitting in the back was very quiet and did not say a word. Jinwan glanced back with the rearview mirror and saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were closed as though he had fallen asleep. 15 minutes later, the car passed by the Mo Corporation. Jinwan continued to step on the accelerator without hesitation, not even intending to stop. When passing by Aolan International, she hesitated. Her first thought was to abduct this man back to the U Garden. After returning to China, he really wouldn't return to the U Garden, so she felt it necessary to take him home. But she was afraid that if he woke up, Auntie Chen wouldn't be able to bear his anger, so she hesitated and turned the car into Aolan International. When the car stopped, Jinwan unfastened her seatbelt and turned back to see that he still hadn't opened his eyes. She opened the door and got out of the car. Then she went around to open the back door and patted him lightly. The man's eyes were closed and he reeked of alcohol. Jinwan patted him again. No reaction. Was he really asleep? Jinwan simply reached out to hold his arm and pulled him out of the car. When the man got out of the car, his entire weight fell on her. She held him with some difficulty, reached out to close the car door, and then staggered all the way into the elevator in the underground parking lot. She finally entered the elevator, but because of the man's height, length, and completely healthy body weight, she, a woman who weighed only about 90 kilograms, could not stand steadily. In the end, she could only lean against the wall of the elevator and bear the man's weight. The man's head hung on her shoulder, and his breath, which reeked of alcohol, brushed against her neck. After being pressed like this for a while, Jinwan poked her head out to look at the number on the elevator. She remembered that she hadn't swiped the elevator card or pressed the floor password, and the elevator was still on the basement floor. She hurriedly pushed him. Let me press the password first. She pushed him for a long time but to no avail. In the end, she could only support him with one hand and reach out with the other. After barely pressing the password, she hurriedly withdrew her hand and tried to support the man's heavy and tall body. It was not until the elevator stopped on their floor that Jinwan forcibly pulled him out of the elevator. In the past, when Mo Jingshan carried her, he could easily carry her by the waist, but when she held him, it was as if she were carrying a stone. He was so heavy and so tall. She couldn't hold him at all. She finally opened the door and helped the man in. Jinwan staggered all the way to the sofa. Fearing that he would fall to the ground, she helped him to sit down on the sofa. Seeing the man leaning against the sofa, Jinwan raised her hand and rubbed her wrist, which was a little sore from supporting him just now. She turned to close the door, changed her shoes, went to the shoe cabinet, took out a pair of men's indoor slippers, and squatted down to help Mo Jingshan change his leather shoes. After working for a long time, she was covered in sweat. Jinwan's face, which was a little pale because she hadn't recovered yet, was now faintly red. After putting on the shoes and turning on the air conditioner, she stood by the sofa, looked at the man leaning against the sofa motionless, and fell into deep thought. She had succeeded in bringing him back. Then, what should she do now? When he was sober, he refused to talk to her. Now that he was so drunk, it was even more impossible for him to talk. At most, he could only be in front of her, where she could touch and see him. She couldn't touch this man all night while he was drunk just because she hadn't touched him for a long time. Could she? As soon as this thought popped up in her mind, Jinwan's lips twitched in disgust. Seeing the man leaning against the sofa with his eyes closed and rubbing between his eyebrows, she simply turned to look for the antidote. As she searched, she looked back at the sofa from time to time. Seeing that he had been sitting there and had no intention of getting up to leave, she lowered her head to continue searching. After finding the antidote, she went to boil water, washed the white towel with cold water, wrung it dry, and quickly walked back to the sofa to wipe his face. Chapter 386. As soon as she met Emo Jingshan's eyes, she clenched the towel and looked into his eyes. Did you wake up just now? Or, I didn't wake up. What are you going to do to me after you brought me back? The man's eyes were deep and quiet. Or do you think you can solve any problem by bringing me back like this? Of course, Jinwan understood that nothing could be solved. It was as if time had passed and the circumstances had changed. When she faced him, she couldn't feel hot at all. Instead, she felt cold all over. Today's Emo Jingshan was not only the CEO Emo, who once terrified the business world, but also the global CEO of Shine Group who shocked and frightened the entire Western financial world. Everything about him was buried under a calm and indifferent shrewdness. Jinwan looked at his face. It was still so handsome, but it was also stained with the coldness and nobility of a superior. It was a face that she missed very much, but when she looked at it, she instinctively felt a chill in her heart. For this man, in addition to missing him, she felt more like a stranger. He was clearly drunk, but his eyes were cold and sharp, like a cold knife cutting her flesh. Jinwan thought for a while and then asked, "When did you wake up? Or were you not drunk at all?" The man sat on the sofa and didn't intend to get up. Or maybe he was a little drunk and didn't intend to get up. He just looked at her and smiled, but his smile made her feel cold. He said slowly, "If I wasn't drunk, how could I allow you to sit in the driver's seat? It's very simple that I drove you back." Shenmu said his girlfriend had a stomachache, which can be serious or minor. He was in a hurry to go back, so he gave me the key. Jinwan said calmly, "I happened to be in that club and happened to not drink, so I drove you back." Emo Jingshan smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. It seemed that he had seen through her purpose at a glance. His eyes were too cold and sharp. Jinwan seemed to have nowhere to hide in front of him. Even if what he did and refused to see her during this time aroused her resistance, she couldn't stand such treatment. If it were in the past, she would have jumped up and left. But Emo Jingshan had always been too good to her, and all his kindness made it impossible for her to be angry at him. Besides, she really missed him too much. But as soon as she met his eyes, Jinwan instinctively avoided his eyes and went into the kitchen. "The water is boiling. I'll make you some hangover medicine." As he spoke, he quickly walked into the kitchen, picked up a glass, and poured some water. Then he placed the medicine into the glass and shook it gently, as if he couldn't feel how hot the glass was. He walked out with the glass and placed it on the coffee table. The man sat there and looked at her fingers that had been scalded red. He looked at the skin on the back of her hand that was slightly redder than before. Although there were still some scars from Cambodia, they were indeed much lighter than a few months ago. He looked at her silently and didn't speak, nor did Jinwan. They were silent for a long time. Jinwan pointed to the glass on the table. "Drink some. Drink it while it's hot. The medicine will take effect faster. Shinmu said you drank a lot tonight, so you may have a stomachache or a headache. You'll feel better after drinking it." Emo Jingshan's face was expressionless, as if he wasn't even interested in the glass of water she poured for him. Or perhaps he was guarding against her. Against what? Was he afraid that she would drug him? Jinwan looked into his eyes. "Do you hate me so much now?" "Obviously." She paused and asked calmly. "When I was in the mall with Xia Tian, I saw you with Shuyan. Did you accompany her shopping? Or was there any other reason?" The man narrowed his eyes at her words. What kind of answer do you want to hear? Jinwan's lips moved. In the past, Mo Jingshan was the person who hated misunderstandings between them the most. Whenever there was the slightest misunderstanding, he would immediately give her a reasonable explanation to set her mind at ease and not let her imagination run wild. She wanted to ask where the Mo Jingshan, who had always firmly pressed against her heart, had gone. But when the words reached her mouth, she suddenly couldn't bring them out. Under the man's cold gaze, Jinwan stood behind the coffee table for a long time and said, I can't understand whether your attitude toward me right now is disgust or wariness or, I don't know what else you mean. But from the beginning, I just wanted to live a good life. I didn't want to cling to anyone. You remember everything in the past, so you should know that my feelings for you and everything I've done are real. Just like how you used to treat me, it's all very pure. Before she finished speaking, she heard the man chuckle. It was the kind of cold, mocking chuckle that came from his chest. It was very light, but she heard it. The man stood up, walked around the coffee table, and the cup of sobering tea on it, and walked up to her. The clear and clean smell of his body mixed with the smell of wine. Subconsciously, Jinwan felt all the pores on her body contract as he suddenly took the initiative to approach her. She raised her eyes to look at him. At the same time, the man leaned down to her, and his breath fell on the skin of her cheek. Pure? Don't you feel embarrassed saying this word to me? Jinwan raised her head to look at him, and looked at him with a stubborn and serious expression that would not be overwhelmed by his aura. Of course I don't feel embarrassed. I just learned a lesson and learned how to cherish, how to avoid all harm, and how to live a good life. I can bear the word pure. It's the same for you, Mo Jingshan. My feelings for you are pure enough. It's fine if you don't believe me, but you can't completely deny me like this. She stared at him steadily. I can't easily give up on the man I once loved, a man who could even throw his life away for me. Right now, even if you directly stab a knife into my body, I won't say a single word. After all, the pain you've experienced is 1,000,000 times worse than mine. Marriage is mine, the man is mine, and the family is what I have to protect. You don't have the right to make me give up. Mo Jingshan raised her chin, his voice soft and slow. So stubborn, so affectionate? Jinwan saw the thick mockery in his eyes. His gaze was as dark and deep as ever, and his voice was as gentle and mild as ever. However, she raised her eyes to look at his cold expression. Aside from coldness, she could not capture any other emotions. Chapter 387. Although Jinwan wasn't seriously injured when she fell down the stairs in the Yew Garden yesterday, her forehead was a little red near her hairline. Other than a nude lipstick, she rarely used foundation, so the spot on her forehead was not covered. When she lowered her head and raised her head, the loose strands of hair fell back a little, revealing the red spot on her forehead. She held the glass in front of him, and froze because of the man's gaze on her forehead. Neither of them spoke. The large space was so quiet that even the drop of a needle could be heard, but Jinwan's heartbeat was strangely particularly loud. The man looked at her and said in a low voice, Jinwan, I never joke. Since you've mentioned divorce, you should break it off completely. He stood in front of her and didn't take the glass in her hand, but just looked down at her indifferently. The light in the living room fell on the top of her head and seemed to cover her with a layer of light silver. He was cold and noble. Even though he reeked of alcohol, it didn't affect his handsomeness and charm at all. Mo Jingshan. He was Mo Jingshan. Jinwan kept reminding herself that no matter how cruel and heartless he was to her now, from the moment he rushed out in that black Bentley to protect her behind his back, she couldn't lose her temper at him. Maybe it was just a broken dream, or maybe it was just a reality and she saw the real him. Don't pester me anymore. I don't like pestering. He didn't raise his hand to take her glass from beginning to end. Seeing the man turn and leave without looking back, Jinwan felt as though her entire body was filled with a sense of helplessness. Her heart was filled with a sense of obstruction. The moment she heard the door open, the glass in Jinwan's hand fell to the ground. The man didn't look back but paused for a moment. Seeing him stand there without moving, and seeing him pause for a moment, Jinwon turned and walked over. She stood behind him and stared at his back for a long time before she slowly raised her hand and carefully hugged him from behind. In the past, when she wanted to hug him, she had never been so careful. She couldn't see the man's deep eyes. She could only feel the man's cruel and merciless hands trying to pull her hands away from him. Jinwon held him tightly. She didn't speak, nor did he. In silence, the two of them seemed to be fighting quietly. Her arms were entangled with his, but her strength was no match for his. He pulled her hand away and threw her back mercilessly. Jinwon took a few steps back and hit the wine cabinet by the wall. The few bottles of wine inside fell out and broke all over the floor. Red, white, and various colors of wine mixed together and flowed to her feet. Jinwon could not help but shiver as she felt the chill from beneath her feet. She looked at the ground and then up at the man in front of the door. His blood seemed to solidify in his body, slowly turning into ice at the same temperature as his blood. It was bone-chilling. Without a word, she suddenly bent down and stepped on the broken pieces on the floor to pick them up. Mo Jingshan turned his eyes to see Jinwon stepping on the broken pieces barefoot. He said coldly without raising his eyelids, "Jinwon, it's the stupidest thing to do to attract my attention by hurting yourself. The wounds on your feet won't move me. It will only make you unable to work for several days in a row. Not only will it delay your work, but it will also make me see your stupidity and boredom." Jinwon squatted on the ground, as if she didn't hear his words. She avoided the broken pieces, but she was still scratched. She moved aside and picked up the broken pieces. After picking up some of them, she said calmly, "I didn't hurt myself." "Really?" He looked at the small but obvious bloodstains at her feet. "Take care of yourself." With that, he walked out of the door. Hearing the door open and close, Jinwon's hands were still mechanically and numbly picking up the broken pieces. When she stepped on the broken pieces, she didn't seem to feel any pain. She got up to get a mop and a broom and swept the broken pieces. When she turned around, she found that there was a long trail of blood on the ground. She simply threw the things in her hands to the corner and sat on the ground that still had a lot of fragments. She sat by the side and watched as a few bottles of wine fell to the ground, with only half of the upper part broken, while the lower part of the wine was still in the bottle. Jinwon picked up one of them. She didn't know what year it was, but she knew it couldn't be cheap since Mo Jingshan kept it at home. She avoided the broken bottle and raised her head to take a sip. It tasted strange and a little bitter. She picked up the other half of the bottle and poured it into her mouth in a way that avoided cutting her mouth. Tut, it was still bitter. She tasted several bottles in a row, but they were all bitter. She smacked her lips and licked the corner of her mouth, only to find that it was the bitter taste in her mouth. After wiping her mouth, she looked at the expensive wine on the ground and really couldn't bear to waste it. She didn't mind those spilled on the ground, but there was still some left at the bottom of the bottle. At least it was worth drinking. She took another sip. This time it was not so bitter, but it was a little astringent. She tasted another sip, and it tasted the same. The woman, who couldn't hold her liquor, sat on the ground with bare white and tender feet. She picked up one bottle after another and drank all the broken bottles. She narrowed her eyes, looked at the quiet closed door, couldn't see Mo Jingshan, and then looked back out of the window. Oh, so many stars. The black ghost sped on the road. Not long after Mo Jingshan left, he went to a nearby drugstore to buy medicine. When he got out of the car, he was about to hand the medicine to the security guard for AO Lawn International to send it up. However, the moment he got out of the car, he suddenly paused. He raised his eyes to see that on the balcony of the 18th floor, a woman in a skirt was sitting at the edge. Her two injured feet were swinging back and forth, and it seemed like a gust of wind could blow her down from the 18th floor. Mo Jingshan's expression darkened. He abruptly slammed the car door shut and picked up his phone to call Jinwon. The woman was still on the balcony unmoving. He didn't know if the phone was placed inside or held in her hand. It rang for a long time before he finally picked it up. The moment the phone was picked up, Mo Jingshan's voice was cold. "Jinwon, what are you doing?" The woman's voice came through the phone in a daze. "Ah, me. What am I doing?" I'm looking at the stars. Mo Jingshan raised his eyes to look at the balcony of the 18th floor. The woman's legs were still swinging back and forth, and one hand was raised to her ear as she answered the phone. Dash. Chapter 388. It's been raining for days. Now the sky is dark and there's nothing. Why are you looking at the stars? Nothing. But I see a lot of stars. With that, the woman on the balcony began to swing her legs back and forth again. Mo Jingshan raised his eyebrows. For a moment, he wondered if this woman had drunk all the wine in the bottles that had fallen on the ground. The door was suddenly opened, and the wind from the door to the open floor-to-ceiling windows fluttered the curtains, fluttering them in the air. The wind also ruffled the woman's skirt and hair on the balcony. Mo Jingshan glanced at the shallow bloodstains and the completely empty broken bottles on the ground, walked in, and saw where Jinwan was sitting on the balcony. Jinwan, come down. Jinwan looked back at him and grinned at him with an intoxicated expression. Why are you back? Didn't you leave? Seeing her turn her head, Mo Jingshan frowned. I asked you to come down, not to move. I'm fine here. It's safe. Jinwan lowered her head to look at where she was sitting, and then muttered. Your wine is really terrible. I didn't know that the wine in your cabinet was worse than the one before. But they must be very expensive, and I couldn't bear to spend them. So I drank all that I could. Hey, guess what? After drinking it, I actually saw stars. As she spoke, she lowered her head, and then proudly crossed her legs on the balcony. Seeing that she actually had the courage to cross her legs, the coldness in Mo Jingshan's eyes rose. Don't move. Jinwan looked at him in confusion. What? Do you also want to see the stars? With that, she suddenly moved her butt to the side. Well, I'll make room for you. Come and see together. Mo Jingshan didn't say a word, abruptly dropped the medicine in his hand, strode over, and grabbed the arm of the woman who was swaying on the balcony. Jinwan was startled by his action, and was about to withdraw her hand instinctively, when she felt a weight on her shoulder, and was carried down from the edge of the balcony by him. The moment her feet landed on the ground, she almost lost her balance and staggered in his arms. She instinctively grabbed his shirt and climbed up, then leaned into his arms, saying in confusion, Mo Jingshan, why are you back? No. I should say, are you back? The man did not speak, but pulled her into the window from the balcony. He slammed the window shut, and was about to push her away when the woman suddenly wrapped her arms around his neck. The smell of alcohol was thicker than his face. She whispered softly by his ear. Are you back? Mo Jingshan, you've only just woken up, aren't you? You're back, aren't you? Mo Jingshan pushed her to the sofa, and when she was about to get up and throw herself at him again, he said indifferently, sit down. Jinwan paused and sat down obediently on the sofa under his cold gaze. The man coldly glanced at her, picked up the broom she had thrown on the ground, swept up the broken pieces, and threw them away. Then he saw the shallow bloodstains on the ground, walked over, and saw that there were some fine glass shards on the soles of Jinwan's feet, and the dust and blood on the ground were stuck to her feet. Seeing the man come over, Jinwan didn't speak, but was suddenly picked up by the man like a chick and brought into the bathroom. Mo Jingshan, what are you doing? She looked at him in confusion. After entering the bathroom, Mo Jingshan was about to ask her to sit on the toilet lid, so that he could help her wash her feet. But the woman was not obedient and moved her hands and feet. Seeing that she was completely drunk, the man suddenly turned on the shower head above, turned the water to the maximum, and poured it on her head and body. Jinwan curled up on the toilet and shivered all over. Her whole body was washed by the cold water, and the shocking coldness made her mind clear for a moment. She raised her eyes, wiped the water off her face, and struggled to get up, but the man still pressed her firmly on the toilet and washed her from head to toe with cold water. What are you doing? Jinwan couldn't speak. As soon as she spoke, water would come into her mouth. Afraid that she would choke, she could only try to turn her head away. Finally, the sound of water stopped. Then the man's voice, colder than the cold water just now, hit her. Awake? Jinwan sat stiffly on the toilet for a long time, and did wake up. She turned to look at the man, whose black shirt and trousers were also splashed by the water, but he was clearly not as disheveled as she was. He looked at her coldly. In order to make me stay, you really spared no effort. Jinwan was stunned for a long time before she recalled the scene when she climbed onto the balcony to look at the stars. Just now there really were no stars. She just drank the mixed wine, and then her eyes were full of stars. Her feet hurt a little, so she walked to the window and opened it. She wanted to see if Mo Jingshan had left, but she didn't know what she was thinking at that time. She actually climbed up and sat there to look at the sky. Her lips, which were pale from the cold water, moved. She raised her head to look at the man's indifferent eyes and said hoarsely, "Why did you come back? If you jump from the 18th floor, your blood will splatter on the spot, and the surrounding companies will be affected. Not only will you use your own life to affect the feng shui of High City, but it will also be bad luck for me to go from being divorced to being widowed." Jin Wan's rationality, which had been eroded by alcohol, was instantly pricked by his voice, and her nerves trembled. The man stared at her quietly with his deep dark eyes. His tone was not heavy, and it was as though he was casually stating an unimportant matter. It's even more stupid to fall to your death from the 18th floor because you're drunk. Don't do such things that will implicate others. Live well. Don't add to anyone's burden. Mo Jingshan threw the towel on her head and turned to walk out without any reluctance. Jin Wan tugged the towel off her head and looked at the man's cold and resolute back. Mo Jingshan, am I a burden to you? The man's long figure paused for a moment. He did not answer, and his back was cold as though he had really pulled out of her world and would never enter again. Jin Wan's eyelids drooped, and her eyes were half closed. Then she slowly stood up with some difficulty. Her long hair wrapped around her shoulders like seaweed, and her white dress was translucent and stuck to her body because it was drenched. She looked like a seductive water demon. Chapter 389. Jin Wan put one hand against the door and raised the other to grab the man's sleeve. She turned her head and looked up at the man's indifferent eyes. Say it, Mo Jingshan. The man's brows were full of indifference. He looked at her calmly and did not answer. Say it. Jin Wan slowly steadied herself in front of the door and held the door tightly with both hands behind her. Say something even more ruthless and cruel. Let me give up completely. Say it. What else can you do if you don't give up? Looking at the redness brewing in her eyes, Mo Jingshan's eyes deepened inch by inch, and his lips curved in a cold and heartless smile. What kind of night do you want to make with the little bit of alcohol in your body and the little bit of alcohol in mine? Or do you think you are charming enough to make me repeat the same mistake with you? As the man spoke, he skillfully pinched her chin with his slender and well-defined fingers, not forcing her to open the door. At the moment when Jin Wan was startled, he leaned over without warning, pressed her against the door, bent his head dangerously and ambiguously to her lips, and chuckled hoarsely and indifferently. Why don't you say it directly? What do you want? And Jin Wan instinctively raised her hand to push him away, but as soon as she raised it, he abruptly held her wrist. His cool and pleasant masculine scent enveloped her, and his breath brushed against her lips. If you want it, just say it. It's just a matter between a man and a woman. Just say it. After all, we've slept together so many times. I'm not so heartless that I won't reject you even if you send yourself to my door. If you say you're lonely, I can understand you. The man's voice was low and indifferent. To be precise, he completely trampled on her self-esteem. Jin Wan was so angry that her tears almost fell. Did he deliberately want to shatter his image and all the good things he had in her heart? Feeling the man's head approaching, Jin Wan subconsciously turned her head away, but he held her chin and turned her face back. When she was about to say that she didn't mean that, the man had firmly imprisoned her, bent down, and accurately landed on her lips. Her lips were covered with the familiar softness. When Jin Wan reacted, the man had pried open her lips and tongue and plunged deep into her mouth. No, Jin Wan struggled hard, but he firmly pressed her arms against the door and she could not move at all. She instinctively raised her legs, but at the same time, the man held her down and she could not move at all. Mo Jingshan Yuug. Jinwan desperately turned her head away. But the man seemed to be deliberately kissing her fiercely. Again and again, he entangled himself in her mouth in a way that made her feel extremely uncomfortable and almost unable to breathe. Jinwan didn't know how long it had been since he last touched or kissed her. She only felt that under the entanglement of such a deep and heavy kiss, all her senses and nerves were trembling violently. Even her heart was beating violently. When the tip of her tongue was lifted, the man's merciless kiss slightly slowed down because of her uncontrollable tears falling into their mouths. For a moment, it seemed that the familiar Mo Jingxian was kissing her, kissing away the salty taste in her mouth, kissing away the wetness in the corner of her mouth, and was about to kiss away the tears on her face, when he paused for a moment. He held the back of her head and looked at her quietly with his deep, bottomless black eyes. He watched the woman lean against the door like a dying fish and breathe heavily because of the kiss a moment ago. Her eyes were red and full of tears. He was silent for a moment, and his eyes were so deep that she could not see through them. He slowly curved his lips. "Is this what you want?" Jinwan's brain trembled. The familiar gentleness at that moment almost confused her. But when the man spoke again, she instinctively tried to push him away. However, the man quickly took her into his arms, pressed her against the door, and held her firmly in his arms. The kiss that fell on her again was even more fierce and deep than before. Jinwan pushed him away in vain, but it had no effect except to make the man hold her more tightly. Her breath seemed to be cruelly robbed, and she fell limp in his arms because it was difficult to breathe. Mo Jingxian finally let go of her and withdrew from her lips. Jinwan's pale face had turned red, and her mouth was full of the man's refreshing taste. She leaned against the door softly and almost slipped down. Her hand weakly held onto the door handle to steady herself. She didn't even have the strength to raise her head to see the expression on his face. She could only hear his cold words falling on her head. "Do you want more? I don't mind fulfilling your wish here tonight." Mo Jingxian's voice was full of condescending mockery. "Since you still refuse to divorce, from a legal point of view, it seems that I can indeed perform this kind of husband and wife duty a few more times before the divorce. I think you must miss it very much." Jinwan couldn't care about anything else. She leaned against the door, lowered her head and panted. Her fingers clenched the door handle motionless. The moment she heard the man's cold smile and asked, "Do you want to continue?" she suddenly let go of the door handle, raised her hand, and was about to slap him in the face. He didn't intend to stop her. He just stood motionless in front of her and looked at her. However, her hand still didn't fall but froze in the air. Looking at the man's cold expression, the image of the black Bentley that was smashed in front of her on the Los Angeles freeway that day flashed in front of her. Jinwan's hand froze in the air. Then she slowly put down her hand, clenched her fists, and her nails dug deep into her palms. "Mo Jingxian, even if I left a bad impression on you, you can't forget all the feelings we have had for each other for so long. Do you really feel good about being so cruel and heartless to me?" His lips curled into a cold and piercing smile. He looked at her with a deep and shallow gaze. She couldn't tell which of his words were true and which were false. His voice was indifferent. "To be honest, even if you really jump off the balcony from where you are standing right now, I won't feel anything. Why would I feel good or bad?" Jinwan's hand loosened and tightened and loosened again, and finally leaned against the door. She lowered her eyes to look at her bare feet, closed her eyes, and then forced a smile. No one knew who she was smiling at. She struggled to twist the door handle behind her, and when the door was opened, she picked up the bag on the shoe cabinet by the door, turned around and walked out, despite the fact that her body and head were still wet. Chapter 390. Jinwan completely ignored the man's voice behind her and didn't answer. She walked straight out, went to the elevator, pressed the down button, and stood there silently waiting for the elevator. Mo Jingxian came out and put a bath towel on her deadpan. "You're all wet. Go in and take a bath. Don't wander around." Jinwan waved the bath towel off her back and said indifferently, "No, this is your place. I shouldn't have come." The man looked at her as if her heart had been hollowed out and didn't speak for a while. At the moment the elevator door opened, Jinwon walked straight in. She had forgotten where she had taken off her shoes when she hurriedly helped him into the house. Anyway, it made no difference whether she wore shoes or not. She walked in barefoot, no longer looking at the man's face. And after counting to 1, the elevator door slowly closed in front of her. Suddenly, the elevator door opened again, and the man stood outside with a cold face, his hand on the button outside the door. When the door was about to close again, he walked in. Jinwon stood against the wall of the elevator and looked at him expressionlessly. "What are you doing? How can you walk like this? Go back with me." The man's face was still cold, but his hand had come over to grab her arm and take her out of the elevator. Jinwon didn't have the strength to break free, and her lips still felt numb. When he reopened the door and brought her back inside, she looked at the familiar space in front of her and said calmly and soberly, "After all, this is your place. As long as I am here, you will definitely leave. I can't always occupy your place. I am a woman who is no longer important to you. When it's time to be self-conscious, I have to be self-conscious and return this place to you." The man ignored her words, put the bath towel on her again, and said coldly with a hint of sternness in his voice, "Go take a bath. I'll go back to the U garden to take a bath. Don't make me say it again." Jinwon stood still, but her heart was cold all over. "Or do you want me to take a bath for you?" Hearing this, she paused. Her hand clutched her bag, and after a long time, she turned around and walked out, not wanting to say another word. However, before she stepped out of the door, her arm was abruptly pulled back. Before she could steady herself, Mo Jingshan dragged her into the bathroom. When Jinwon was about to push him away, he raised his hand and grasped her wrist, making it impossible for her to escape. He said dangerously and threateningly, "I'll give you one last chance. Wash yourself, or I'll tear your clothes off right now." Mo Jingshan. Her voice was sullen and hoarse. The man was indifferent. His hands were already about to tear her clothes. "No." Jinwon hurriedly raised her hand to press against her clothes, using her bent elbow to push him away. "Are you going to wash or not?" This seemed to be his last warning. Jinwon was indeed very cold. She had caught a cold these days, and she had even taken a cold shower earlier. She was cold from the inside out. Her teeth were chattering. She didn't know if it was because of the cold, or because she was afraid. Only now did she realize that there would actually be a day when she would be afraid of Mo Jingshan. Earlier, when he kissed her, he did not hold back. If he really took off her clothes like this, or if something really happened here tonight, she suspected that she might lose half her life. When he was gentle to her, his strength was enough to make her unable to get out of bed. If he were to touch her under such circumstances, who knew what would happen to her? "I'll wash myself." She held on to her clothes. He stepped back, walked around the water stains on the floor, and walked out of the bathroom again. He only threw down a cold sentence. 15 minutes. "If you don't come out, I'll come in." Jinwon looked at his back, and then at the bathtub by the side. He forced her to come back to take a hot shower, but only gave her 15 minutes to take a shower? She turned to close the bathroom door, and then took off her wet and sticky clothes. She only had 15 minutes to take a shower, and there was no time to soak in the bathtub. She picked up the shower head that Mo Jingshan had thrown aside, turned on the hot water, and washed herself well. She washed herself from head to toe. She didn't know how long it had been. It should be almost 15 minutes. She turned off the water, put on the bathtub, and went out. After all, she had lived in Aolan International before, so there were many of her clothes in the bedroom closet. She was about to enter the bedroom to change, when she suddenly heard Mo Jingshan throw 2 boxes of medicine on the coffee table. "Take the antipyretics before going to bed. Even if the injury on your foot is not serious, apply some medicine. Don't get yourself covered in scars." Jinwon turned to see the medicine he had placed on the coffee table. She had only caught a cold, and her fever was not serious. Earlier, did he feel an unusual heat on her body? He was very familiar with her body, and could even detect the slightest abnormality. But right now, she was completely unfamiliar with him, even a stranger. She did not speak, and went into the bedroom to change. When she came out, Mo Jingxian had already disappeared. Jinwan thought that he had found his conscience for a moment, or had recovered his usual patience and gentleness, telling her to take a shower, eat, and take the medicine. But it turned out that he was no longer accompanying her but leaving. In such a large apartment, every room was particularly empty and quiet. She walked to the sofa and sat down. She picked up the medicine box and opened it. She dug out a pill of antipyretics and put it in her mouth. She turned to see the medicine on the sofa. It did not look like the medicine in the medicine box, but seemed to be newly bought. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Earlier, did Mo Jingxian go out to buy medicine for her, because her foot was scratched by the shrapnel? She narrowed her eyes. This man who clearly seemed to want to push her away, but still seemed to want to control her. What exactly did he mean? Jinwan placed the medicine down, and calculated that Mo Jingxian had only gone down for a few minutes. It would take at least 2 minutes for the elevator to go down from the 18th floor. She hesitated, stood up, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She opened the windows and stepped onto the balcony again, looking down. The black ghost was parked there. The car lights were already on, indicating that the man had gotten into the car, but did not drive away. Jinwan stared at the car below. She stood on the balcony and watched for more than 10 minutes, but the car really did not leave. Was he afraid that she would climb onto the balcony again to court death? If she really climbed onto the balcony, the most dangerous position, would he come up again? Jinwan's hand gently stroked the edge of the balcony railing. She laughed at her own shameful and ridiculous thoughts. Chapter 391. Jinwan left the balcony, closed the window, and returned to the sofa. She picked up the medicine to apply to the wound under her foot while looking at her cell phone. After applying the medicine, she picked up her cell phone and sent a text message to Mo Jingxian. "I'm sleeping. Good night." After sending the message, after a while when the medicine under her foot was dry, she got up and went to the balcony again. When she looked down, the car had already left. Jinwan raised her eyes to look at the heavy traffic on the long street in the distance. He cared about her life and death, but he refused to have feelings for her. Interesting. Really interesting. Since you want me to live well so much, then Mo Jingxian, from today on, I will live a nourishing and exciting life. So exciting that you can't even avoid it. You can see my shadow everywhere. High City in summer was hot enough. M1 studio was about to move to a new location. The office building had been built, and some of the internal offices needed to be cleaned up. It would probably be completed in more than a week. Jinwan, wearing a loose white printed t-shirt and casual shorts, was busy in the office with the tools for painting the wall in her hand. Xia Tian had just returned from buying a dozen popsicles, and saw that the others who had come in to clean up the office had gone to bed. But Jinwan was still working hard. You really don't think of yourself as a boss. So many of your employees have sat down to rest. Why are you still painting there alone? Didn't the renovation workers say that these places will be blocked by glass? It's useless to paint them white. Anyway, they can't see them. Xia Tian went over and took out a popsicle from the bag and handed it to her. It's so hot. The building hasn't been connected to electricity, and the air conditioner isn't working. I'm sweating all over. Come and cool down. Jinwan painted the last part of the office white, put down the tools in her hand, raised her hand to wipe the sweat on her face, and a piece of white paste on her hand rubbed against her cheek. There was not only white on her face, but also on her nose, chin, and neck. Xia Tian held back her laughter and handed her the popsicle. Eat it first. Remember to wash your face later. Jinwan looked at her in confusion, tore open the bag of popsicles and said, "Why are you laughing? Have you never seen such a beautiful boss? I've never seen a boss who looks like he's possessed by a fierce bull. What's wrong with you this week? Some time ago, you were dispirited and listless, but recently, you're full of motivation. You even work so hard. I don't think you need to work out recently. You just need to accompany the group of workers in this building to decorate and paint the walls." Jinwan took the wet towel from Xiaoba and wiped her hands. Then she took a bite of the popsicle and turned to look at the wall in the office. I don't plan to put glass there anymore. I plan to put something else. It's more comfortable to paint it in the same color. Xiaotian raised her eyebrows and glanced at the white patches on her face. When I went out just now, I met Vince in a nearby cafe. He is the one who has been sending you flowers. He knows that you are here and said that he will treat us to iced coffee in a while. He specially invited you. Will you go with him? Jinwan was expressionless. Didn't I tell you to tell him not to send me flowers in the future? You know what I mean. Why did you still agree to his invitation? Xiaotian spread out her hands. Boss Missouri has been hard to find recently. I have to find a second love for you. As the best bestie in the world. Don't you understand my good intentions? Jinwan rolled her eyes. I think you're tired of my peaceful life and want to stir up some trouble for me. I'm not interested in that Mr. Vince. If he wants to cooperate with me on a new project, I can meet him. But don't talk about anything else. Do you have to be so principled? You have principles, but that doesn't mean your husband has them. This morning, I saw a business magazine taking a photo of Mo Jingshan at an exhibition. Several of High City's socialites also attended the exhibition. As Xiaotian spoke, she looked at Jinwan seriously. Those socialites are still eyeing him covetously. They won't miss a single exhibition. They all stand behind him and ask to take a photo with him. And look at you. Every day, you dress up like a decorator. Even I feel embarrassed to say that you're Mrs. Mo. Jinwan nibbled the popsicle seriously and said carelessly, I also received the invitation to the exhibition, but I didn't attend it. So what if you were photographed standing with them? Did you see them kissing or hugging? When did you become so open-minded? Xiaotian looked at her incredulously and raised her hand to touch her head. A while ago, I thought you would collapse at any time like Lin Daiyu, but it seems that you don't look like that recently. Jinwan slapped her hand away, raised her hand to touch her head, and casually explained, I just feel that some things are not what they seem on the surface. Life has to go on. I can't keep living in depression and making my life a mess. Xiaotian sneered. That's so profound. I don't understand. Big sister, can you explain it a little more simply? Jinwan bit the popsicle and said vaguely, I can only say that I'm more persevering in fighting. Xiaotian chuckled and wanted to touch her head again to see if she really had a fever. However, after eating the popsicle, Jinwan picked up the tools, turned back to the office, climbed up the high stool nimbly, and continued to paint the wall. Xiaoba leaned over to Xiaotian and whispered, Sister Xia, who provoked boss? Xiaotian shook her head. I don't know. I think maybe he was really provoked. With that, Xiaotian was about to step forward to help Jinwan when she saw a business magazine on the high stool Jinwan was stepping on. The cover of the magazine was the one in which Mo Jingshan and those love-struck ladies were photographed in the same frame. But this magazine was being stepped on by Jinwan as a footrest. Xiaotian. Jinwan was busy in the new office building for 2 days. Xiaotian persuaded her to go back, but she ignored her. Her cell phone was left here without charging and was turned off for 2 days. When she left the building and was about to go back to the studio, she charged her cell phone in the car and turned it on. As she expected, she saw a large number of messages and missed calls pouring in. If her partners couldn't reach her, they would naturally call other people in the studio. Most of the missed calls were from the Mo family. They were from the Mo family. Then there were calls from the Yu Garden and Auntie Chen. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.